In the quiet valleys of ancient Greece, beneath skies where gods and mortals still shared the world, our story begins. As you settle deeper into comfort, let us journey back to a time of heroes and legends, to the first of the 12 great labors that would immortalize the name of Heracles. Before he was a hero whose name would echo through millennia, Heracles was born a prince, son of Zeus, king of the gods, and Alcmene, a mortal woman of noble lineage. His very birth ignited the jealousy of Hera, Zeus's divine wife, who resented this living reminder of her husband's infidelity. This jealousy would cast a long shadow over Heracles' life, eventually leading him down a path of both tremendous suffering and extraordinary achievement. In a moment of madness, sent by the vengeful Hera, Heracles committed a terrible act against those he loved most dearly. When clarity returned and he beheld what he had done in his divine frenzy, he was overcome with unbearable grief. Seeking purification and atonement, he consulted the oracle of Delphi, whose sacred voice decreed that he must serve King Eurystheus of Mycenae for 12 years and complete any tasks the king required. Through this service and suffering, he would find the redemption his soul so desperately sought. And so begins the tale of the first labor, the slaying of the Nemean Lion. In the region of Nemea, nestled between gentle hills and peaceful valleys, terror had taken residence. A lion of supernatural size and ferocity haunted the countryside, bringing fear and death wherever it went. But this was no ordinary lion, born of Typhon and Echidna, monstrous progenitors of many Greek beasts. The Nemean lion possessed a golden hide so impenetrable that no weapon forged by mortal hands could pierce it. No blade, no arrow, no spear could draw its blood. From its lair in the hills, the lion would descend upon the surrounding villages, devouring livestock and any unfortunate souls who crossed its path. The people of Nemea lived in constant fear, afraid to venture beyond their homes, their once productive fields now lying fallow, their pastures empty of grazing animals. When King Eurystheus commanded Heracles to slay this seemingly invulnerable beast and bring back its pelt as proof, he believed he was sending the hero to certain death. What better way to be rid of this potential threat to his throne than to have him fall in the claws of a monster that no weapon could harm? As Heracles journeyed toward Nemea, the landscape gradually transformed around him. Flourishing olive groves gave way to sparser vegetation. The sound of birdsong diminished. Villages became fewer and further apart, and those he did encounter seemed hushed, their inhabitants withdrawn behind closed doors and shuttered windows, fear having become their constant companion. In one such village, as Heracles stopped to rest and gather information, an elderly shepherd approached him. The old man's face was weathered by years of sun and wind, his eyes deep with the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of observing nature. The beast has 2 layers, the shepherd told him, voice quavering slightly as he spoke of the dreaded lion. One cave has 2 entrances, while the other has only one. The creature is clever. It drives its prey toward the cave with 2 openings, only to emerge from the single entrance on the other side, catching them unawares. Heracles thanked the shepherd for this valuable insight, recognizing that knowledge could be as powerful as any weapon in the hunt ahead. He continued his journey, carrying his wooden club carved from a wild olive tree he had uprooted with his bare hands and his bow across his broad shoulders. As he ventured deeper into Nemean territory, Signs of the lion's presence became increasingly apparent. Massive paw prints pressed into soft earth, deep claw marks scoring tree trunks, and most disturbing of all, scattered bones bleaching under the Mediterranean sun, silent testimony to the beast's lethal hunts. For days, Heracles tracked the creature, studying its patterns and learning its territory. He discovered both caves the shepherd had mentioned and formulated his strategy. Rather than falling victim to the lion's hunting technique, he would turn the tables and use the beast's own tactics against it. When evening came, as the sun began its descent behind the western hills, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Heracles set his plan in motion. He blocked the second entrance to the lion's primary den with heavy boulders, ensuring there would be only one way in and one way out. Then he concealed himself near the remaining entrance, his powerful frame hidden behind a stand of cypress trees, and waited. Night fell completely, wrapping the world in darkness. Stars emerged one by one in the velvet sky, their distant light offering little illumination to the scene below. An owl called softly from somewhere in the darkness, its voice the only sound breaking the tense silence. Near midnight, a low, rumbling growl announced the lion's return from its nightly hunt. In the faint starlight, Heracles caught his first glimpse of his adversary, larger than any normal lion, with a coat that seemed to capture and reflect the meager light, making it appear as if fashioned from living gold. Its massive head was crowned with a thick, majestic mane, and its eyes gleamed with an almost supernatural intelligence. Heracles remained motionless, barely breathing, as the lion padded toward its cave. Only when the beast had entered did Heracles make his move. Silently, he approached the entrance, his club raised, ready to strike. But the lion, with senses far keener than those of an ordinary beast, detected his presence and lunged from the darkness with terrifying speed. Heracles swung his mighty club, connecting with the lion's flank. The blow, which would have shattered the bones of any normal creature, merely caused the Nemean Lion to stumble slightly. It recovered almost instantly, confirming what Heracles had heard. Its hide truly was impervious to weapons. Realizing his club would be of limited use, Heracles knocked an arrow to his bow and loosed it at the beast. The arrow, despite being aimed with perfect accuracy, simply glanced off the golden fur, falling uselessly to the ground. A second and third arrow met the same fate, either bouncing away or shattering against the impenetrable hide. The lion, enraged by the attack, charged at Heracles with jaws wide, seeking to clamp its terrible teeth around the hero's throat. Heracles narrowly evaded those deadly jaws, feeling the rush of air as they snapped shut mere inches from his face. For hours, this deadly dance continued in the darkness outside the cave. Heracles would strike with his club, momentarily stunning the beast, only to have it recover and attack again with renewed fury. His arrows proved useless, and even his godlike strength seemed insufficient against the lion's magical protection. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Heracles found himself being driven back toward the cave entrance. Both he and the lion were tiring, but Heracles knew that in a contest of endurance, even his demigod stamina might not outlast the supernatural beast. He needed to end this confrontation soon. In a moment of clarity, Heracles allowed himself to be driven back into the lion's own den. The confused beast followed, expecting to corner its prey in the familiar darkness of its lair. But Heracles had studied the cave's layout during his tracking and knew it well. As the lion entered deeper into the cave, Heracles circled around in the darkness, positioning himself between the beast and the only exit. The lion, realizing it had been outmaneuvered, charged at Heracles with desperate fury. But this time, instead of avoiding the attack, Heracles stood his ground. As the beast leapt toward him, he dropped his weapons and extended his mighty arms, catching the lion in midair. Now began the true test of strength, a wrestling match between the greatest of heroes and a beast of divine parentage. With his bare hands, Heracles grappled with the enormous creature, his muscles straining against its supernatural power. The lion thrashed and clawed, leaving deep scratches on the hero's skin, but Heracles maintained his grip. Gradually, he maneuvered his arms around the lion's thick neck and began to squeeze. The cave echoed with the beast's roars, which slowly weakened to growls, then to whimpers, and finally to silence. Even with its invulnerable hide, the lion needed to breathe, and against strangulation, its magical protection offered no defense. As morning light filtered into the cave entrance, Heracles stood over the fallen form of the Nemean Lion, victorious but not unscathed. The battle had tested even his legendary strength to its limits. Now came another challenge. King Eurystheus had demanded the lion's pelt as proof of the completed task, but Heracles quickly discovered that the beast's hide was as impervious to his knife as it had been to his arrows. How could he skin a creature whose hide no blade could cut? Once again, Heracles found wisdom in adversity. If no external tool could penetrate the lion's skin, perhaps something of the lion itself could do the job. Using one of the beast's own razor-sharp claws, Heracles carefully skinned the creature, claiming its magnificent golden pelt as both trophy and armor. Draping the lion's hide over his shoulders, with the great head serving as a helm, Heracles made his way back to Mycenae. The journey was long, but his step was lighter now, buoyed by this first victory. As he passed through villages that had lived under the lion's shadow, people emerged from their homes to gaze in wonder at the hero who had liberated them from terror. When Heracles presented himself before King Eurystheus, wearing the golden hide of the slain Nemean Lion, the king was struck with fear. He had never expected Heracles to return, much less triumphant. From that day forward, the cowardly king would not allow Heracles into his presence. Instead, he would issue commands through a herald, and Heracles would present proof of his completed labors from outside the city gates. As for the lion's pelt, it became Heracles' signature garment and most effective armor. Its golden fur gleamed in the sunlight as he set forth toward his second labor, a visible symbol of his first great victory and a protection against dangers yet to come. And so concluded the first of the 12 labors of Heracles, a tale of courage, ingenuity, and the triumph of mortal wisdom over seemingly insurmountable odds. As you drift toward the edges of sleep, imagine the hero walking away from Nemea, the golden lion's skin upon his shoulders, his face turned toward new horizons and new challenges, his path of redemption just beginning. As the gentle night embraces you once more, let us continue our journey alongside Heracles, the mighty hero whose labors have become legend. Having conquered the fearsome Nemean lion, Heracles now wore its impenetrable hide as both trophy and armor. But King Eurystheus, still determined to see the hero fail, soon assigned a second task even more daunting than the first. Our tale takes us to the marshes of Lerna, a place of mist-shrouded pools and ancient mysteries, where waterbirds called in haunting tones and pale reeds swayed in the brackish waters. It was said that somewhere in these treacherous wetlands lurked a creature of nightmare, the Lernaean Hydra. Sister to the Nemean Lion, the Hydra was another offspring of the monstrous Typhon and Echidna. But while the lion had terrorized the hills and villages with its strength and invulnerability, the Hydra presented a different kind of horror. Imagine, if you will, a serpentine body larger than several men, with not one but 9 heads, each capable of delivering a fatal bite. More terrifying still was the creature's ability to regenerate. For every head severed, 2 more would grow in its place, making the beast seemingly impossible to defeat. The ancient people of Lerna lived in constant fear of the monster, which would emerge from its lair near the springs of Amymone to devour livestock, travelers, and anyone unfortunate enough to venture too close to its domain. Some even whispered that the beast was the guardian of an entrance to the underworld itself, placed there by Hera, who now saw in it a perfect instrument for Heracles' destruction. When Heracles received his second labor to slay the Hydra, he knew that this task would require more than just strength. Unlike the Nemean Lion, this foe could not be defeated by might alone. Wisdom and strategy would be essential. Before departing for Lerna, Heracles sought the advice of Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare. She counseled him to carefully observe the creature and find the weakness in its seemingly perfect defense. Not all victories come from confrontation, she told him. Sometimes the indirect path leads to success. Heracles also prepared practical tools for his journey. He fashioned a number of arrows, coating their tips with poison collected from deadly herbs and venomous creatures. These would later prove crucial, though not in the way he initially imagined. As companion for this labor, Heracles brought along his nephew Iolaus, a young man who had often assisted him and whom he had trained in the arts of combat. The two set off for Lerna, traveling through sun-dappled olive groves that gradually gave way to darker, wilder landscapes. As they approached the marshes, the air grew heavy with moisture and the rich scent of decay. Cypress trees draped with hanging moss created eerie silhouettes against the misty backdrop. The usual chorus of birds and insects fell silent, as if nature itself held its breath in the presence of the lurking horror. Following the directions given by local villagers, who spoke in hushed, fearful tones, Heracles and Iolaus made their way to the center of the marshlands. They moved cautiously, testing each step on the treacherous ground, where seemingly solid earth might suddenly give way to deep, sucking mud. Near a series of bubbling springs, they discovered the entrance to the Hydra's lair, a cave half submerged in dark water, its mouth yawning like an open wound in the earth. The stench of death and decay emanating from the opening was almost overwhelming, a miasma of rotting flesh and stagnant water. Heracles devised a strategy to lure the beast from its den. He dipped several arrows in pitch, set them aflame, and shot them deep into the cave. The burning missiles hissed as they struck the watery interior, filling the cavern with smoke and steam. The response was immediate and terrifying. With a sound like rushing water, combined with the hiss of 1,000 snakes, the Hydra emerged from its lair. First came one horned head, then another and another, until all 9 were visible, weaving hypnotically on serpentine necks. The creature's main body was massive and scaled, dragging itself forward on multiple clawed limbs that splashed through the shallow water. Each head of the Hydra was slightly different, some broader, some more narrow, some with frills or horns, but all shared the same cold, reptilian eyes and slavering jaws lined with needle-sharp teeth. Venom dripped from these fangs, sizzling where it fell upon the water's surface and killing small creatures instantly. Heracles knocked an arrow to his mighty bow and loosed it at the nearest head. The arrow found its mark, burying itself in the creature's eye. The wounded head thrashed in pain, but the Hydra only seemed enraged rather than seriously injured. It lunged forward, all 9 heads striking like lightning toward the hero. Wielding his club with godlike speed, Heracles managed to deflect most of the attacks, though one head succeeded in grazing his arm. Even this slight contact was enough for the venom to burn his skin like fire. Heracles knew then that he could not allow even a single bite from this monster, for its poison would mean certain death. Changing tactics, Heracles dropped his bow and retrieved his sword. As one of the Hydra's heads lunged toward him, he swung with all his might, severing the head in a single clean stroke. For a moment, he felt a surge of triumph until he watched in horror as the bleeding stump pulsed and split, giving birth to 2 new, fully formed heads where one had been before. The tales were true, Heracles called to Iolaus, who watched from a safer distance. We cannot defeat it by conventional means. Retreating temporarily to higher ground, Heracles considered his predicament. The Hydra pursued, but slowly, its bulk making it cumbersome on land. This gave the hero precious moments to think. If cutting off the heads only made the creature stronger, he would need to prevent the regeneration somehow. It was then that Heracles remembered Athena's words about finding an indirect path to victory. Fire, he murmured. We must use fire. He quickly instructed Iolaus to gather branches and create torches. When I cut off a head, he explained, you must immediately cauterize the stump with flame. The fire will prevent new heads from growing. Armed with this new strategy, Heracles re-entered the battle. He approached the Hydra, drawing its attention while Iolaus circled around with the burning torches. When the nearest head struck, Heracles dodged the snapping jaws and swung his sword in a powerful arc, severing the head cleanly. Now, Iolaus, he shouted. The young man darted forward with remarkable courage, pressing a blazing torch against the bleeding stump. The wound sizzled and blackened, sealing itself, and true to Heracles' theory, no new heads emerged. One by one, they repeated this process. Heracles would sever a head, and Iolaus would swiftly cauterize the wound. Each success made the next attempt more dangerous, as the remaining heads seemed to learn from the fate of their companions, attacking with greater coordination and ferocity. The battle continued for hours, man and monster locked in a deadly dance through the misty marshland. The Hydra's multiple heads gave it a significant advantage, able to attack from several directions at once. More than once, Heracles barely escaped its venomous fangs, while Iolaus had several close calls as he darted in to apply the fire to each severed neck. As the number of heads diminished, the Hydra became increasingly desperate. It thrashed its enormous body, creating waves that nearly knocked Iolaus off his feet. Its remaining heads struck with redoubled speed, making Heracles' timing all the more crucial. Finally, Only one head remained, but this was the Hydra's central head, larger than the others, and according to legend, immortal. It could not be killed by any conventional means. Yet Heracles was not deterred. With a mighty swing of his sword, he severed this final head, and Iolaus rushed forward to cauterize the wound, as he had done with the others. The headless body of the Hydra continued to thrash for several moments before finally collapsing into the murky waters of the marsh, sending up a great splash that soaked both Heracles and Iolaus to the skin. The monster was defeated, but Heracles knew his task was not quite complete. Remembering the potency of the Hydra's venom, Heracles carefully collected the severed immortal head in a golden cloth, then extracted venom from its fangs. With this deadly substance, he dipped the tips of his arrows, creating weapons of terrible power that would serve him well in future labors. Some versions of the tale say that during this battle, Hera sent a giant crab to distract and attack Heracles, hoping to aid her monstrous champion. Heracles crushed this creature beneath his heel, and in recognition of its service, Hera placed it among the stars as the constellation Cancer. When Heracles returned to Mycenae to report his victory to King Eurystheus, the king was displeased. He declared that this labor would not count toward the required 10 because Heracles had received assistance from Iolaus. It was an unjust ruling, but Heracles accepted it without complaint, knowing that his true worth was measured by his deeds, not by the recognition of a fearful king. The defeat of the Lernaean Hydra brought peace to the region of Lerna. Farmers could once again work their fields without fear, and travelers could pass through the marshlands safely. The springs of Amymone, once poisoned by the monster's presence, gradually returned to their former purity. Having defeated both the invulnerable Nemean Lion and the many-headed Lernaean Hydra, Heracles now faced his third labor, a task that would test not his strength, but his patience, persistence, and restraint. For his third challenge, King Eurystheus commanded Heracles to capture the Ceryneian Hind, a magnificent deer sacred to the goddess Artemis. This was no ordinary deer, but a creature of wonder and divine beauty. The hind was said to have golden antlers like a stag, though she was female, and hooves of bronze that made a musical sound when she ran. Her coat shimmered with a radiance that caught the sunlight like polished metal, and she moved with such speed and grace that she seemed to float above the earth rather than touch it. This magnificent creature roamed the wilderness of Cerynea, occasionally glimpsed by hunters or shepherds who would speak of her beauty in reverent tones. Some claimed she was one of 5 such deer that pulled the chariot of Artemis, goddess of the hunt and wilderness. Others said she was a gift from the nymph Taygete to Artemis, a sacred being under the goddess's special protection. King Eurystheus knew well that in commanding Heracles to capture this divine creature, he was placing the hero in a precarious position. If Heracles harmed the sacred hind, he would incur the wrath of Artemis, a goddess known for her swift and merciless punishment of those who offended her. Yet if he failed to complete the task, he would extend his period of servitude and delay his redemption. Heracles understood the delicate nature of this labor. Unlike the monsters he had faced before, the hind was not evil or destructive. It was an innocent, sacred animal that had done no harm. His task was not to slay it, but to capture it alive and bring it back to Mycenae, all without causing it harm or drawing the anger of its divine protector. Before setting out, Heracles visited a temple of Artemis. There he made offerings and whispered a prayer. Gracious daughter of Zeus, mistress of the wild, I seek not to harm your sacred creature, but must fulfill the task assigned to me. Grant me your understanding in this endeavor. Whether the goddess heard his prayer or not, no sign was given. Heracles departed, carrying only the most essential supplies. He wore, as always, the impenetrable hide of the Nemean Lion, and carried his bow with arrows tipped in the deadly venom of the Hydra. Yet he hoped he would need neither protection nor weapon for this task. The journey to Cerynea was long, leading Heracles through varied landscapes, from the cultivated fields near Mycenae, through olive groves and vineyards, across mountain passes, and finally into the wild forested foothills where the sacred hind was said to dwell. Upon reaching Cerynea, Heracles began what would become a legendary pursuit. At first, he tried conventional hunting methods, tracking prints, following paths worn through the underbrush, watching for signs of the deer's passing. But the Ceryneian Hind was no ordinary quarry. Her bronze hooves left little impression on the forest floor, and she moved with such speed that conventional tracking proved futile. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Heracles would catch fleeting glimpses of the hind, a flash of gold among the trees, the distant sound of bronze hooves upon stone, only to find her gone when he reached the spot. She seemed to possess an uncanny awareness of his presence, always staying just beyond his reach. As the seasons changed around him, Heracles adapted his strategy. Rather than pursue the hind directly, he began to study her habits and patterns. He observed the places she frequented, certain meadows where she grazed in early morning light, streams where she drank in the golden hour before sunset, clearings where she would sometimes rest beneath the stars. Instead of chasing, Heracles started to predict where the hind would be. He would position himself downwind and remain motionless for hours, his patience extending beyond what most mortals could endure. Sometimes he would see her, radiant and peaceful, unaware of his presence, but always at a distance too great for capture. Summer gave way to autumn, and the forest transformed around Heracles. Leaves turned from green to brilliant gold and fiery red before falling to carpet the earth. The air grew cooler, and morning frost painted the landscape in delicate patterns. Still, the pursuit continued. Autumn yielded to winter, and snow began to blanket the mountains. The hind's golden antlers and bronze hooves now stood out starkly against the white landscape, making her easier to spot, but no easier to capture. The cold tested even Heracles' legendary endurance, but he persisted, driven by determination and duty. As for Heracles, he continued on his path of redemption, the Nemean Lion's pelt still draped across his shoulders, his quiver now filled with arrows dipped in the deadly venom of the Hydra. 2 labors completed, 10 more awaited him, each seemingly impossible, each a test of not just his legendary strength, but his courage, wisdom, and endurance. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the hero standing at the edge of the now peaceful marshland, his silhouette outlined against the setting sun, his face turned toward new horizons. For Heracles' journey was far from over, and his next labor would take him on a chase across the mountains of Greece in pursuit of a creature as swift as the wind itself, the Ceryneian Hind. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and new life burst forth in the forest. Flowers bloomed, birds returned from their southern sojourns, and young animals took their first tentative steps into the world. Nearly a year had passed since Heracles had begun his quest, and still the sacred hind remained free. But the hero's persistence was about to be rewarded. One day, as the hind paused to drink from a clear mountain stream, Heracles was positioned perfectly. He had been waiting motionless since before dawn, concealed among the new foliage of spring. The hind was closer than she had ever been, her reflection shimmering in the water as she lowered her head to drink. With speed that belied his massive frame, Heracles sprang from his hating place. The hind, startled, leapt away with incredible grace, her bronze hooves barely touching the ground. Thus began the final chase, a test of endurance between the greatest of heroes and the swiftest of divine creatures. Through forest and meadow, across streams and ravines, up steep mountainsides, and down into valleys they ran. The hind always maintained her lead, but could not fully escape the tireless pursuit of Heracles. Both hunter and hunted were beings of extraordinary power, she with her divine speed, he with his semi-divine stamina. The chase continued through the day and into the night, under the light of a full moon that silvered the landscape. Neither would yield, neither would tire, but Heracles knew that even the magical deer must eventually need rest. His strategy was simple but effective, not to outrun her, but to outlast her. As dawn broke on the second day of the chase, Heracles observed the first signs of the hind's wearying. Her pace, while still remarkably swift, had slowed just enough to be noticeable. The distance between them gradually decreased as they crossed a high mountain pass and began to descend toward the sea. It was near the shores of the northern sea, where the hind had nowhere left to run, that Heracles finally closed the distance. As the exhausted deer paused momentarily, Heracles took his opportunity. Some versions of the tale say he captured her with his bare hands in a gentle but firm grasp. Others claim he used a net of golden thread given to him by Athena. Still others suggest that he released one of his arrows, not to kill or wound, but to pin the hind's legs together by passing through the gap above her hooves and below her ankles, entangling but not harming her. Whichever method he used, Heracles succeeded in capturing the Ceryneian Hind, alive and unharmed, after a chase that had lasted a full year. He lifted the sacred animal onto his broad shoulders, treating her with gentle reverence despite his triumph. The journey back to Mycenae would not be without its challenges. As Heracles made his way through a forested region with his prize, a figure stepped into his path, blocking the way forward. It was Artemis herself, goddess of the hunt, her silver bow drawn and an arrow nocked, her eyes flashing with divine anger. "Son of Zeus," she spoke, her voice both beautiful and terrible, "you dare to lay hands on my sacred hind? You who know well that this creature is under my protection." Heracles, respectful but unafraid, carefully set the hind down and bowed his head to the goddess. "Divine Artemis," he replied, "I do this not of my own will, but as a labor assigned by King Eurystheus, as penance for my past transgressions. I have pursued this magnificent creature for a full turning of the seasons, and have captured her without causing harm to even a single golden hair on her coat." He continued, "I had planned to return her to you unharmed after showing her to Eurystheus as proof of my completed labor. I seek not to keep her or to diminish your honor, but only to fulfill my obligation. Artemis studied Heracles for a long moment, her divine perception seeing the truth in his words. Her bow remained drawn, the arrow still aimed at his heart. "You walk a dangerous path, son of Zeus," she finally said. "Had you wounded my hind, not even your divine father could have protected you from my wrath." After another tense moment, the goddess lowered her bow. "Complete your task, Heracles, but know this: the hind must be returned to me afterward. She belongs in the wild forests under my protection, not in the courts of mortal kings." Heracles bowed deeply. "You have my word, daughter of Zeus. Once King Eurystheus has seen that I have completed this labor, I will return your sacred hind to the forests of Cerynea, as swift and free as when I found her." Satisfied with his pledge, Artemis allowed Heracles to continue his journey. Some accounts say that she even blessed his continued labors, impressed by his respect and determination. When Heracles arrived at Mycenae with the golden antlered hind upon his shoulders, King Eurystheus was both surprised and dismayed. He had not expected the hero to succeed in such a difficult task, especially without incurring the wrath of Artemis. Ever devious, the king attempted to take possession of the sacred animal, hoping that this would cause Artemis to direct her anger at Heracles instead. But Heracles, anticipating this trick, had planned ahead. As Eurystheus reached for the hind, Heracles loosened his grip ever so slightly. The swift creature leapt from his arms and bounded away with incredible speed, disappearing into the wilderness before the king could lay a hand on her. Heracles spread his hands in a gesture of helpless apology. "Forgive me, my king," he said with carefully concealed satisfaction. "I captured the hind as commanded and brought her here for you to witness. If she has escaped before you could claim her, that is unfortunate, but my labor is complete nonetheless." Eurystheus, frustrated but unable to deny that Heracles had fulfilled the requirements of the task, was forced to acknowledge the completion of the third labor. The sacred hind, meanwhile, returned to her beloved forests, perhaps guided by the invisible hand of Artemis herself. This third labor revealed a different kind of heroism than the first two. While the defeat of the Nemean Lion showed Heracles' strength and courage, and the slaying of the Hydra demonstrated his strategic thinking, the capture of the Ceryneian Hind proved his patience, persistence, and respect for divine boundaries. As you drift toward sleep, imagine Heracles standing at the edge of a forest, watching as the golden antlered hind disappears among the trees, a smile of satisfaction on his face despite the year of effort her capture had cost him. For he had completed his third labor not just successfully, but honorably, earning the respect of even the gods themselves. And so, with 3 labors now behind him, Heracles turned his thoughts to the challenge that awaited him next, the fierce Erymanthian Boar, whose savage nature would test our hero in yet another way on his path to redemption. Following his successful capture of the Ceryneian Hind, Heracles found little time to rest before King Eurystheus assigned him his 4th labor. This time, the hero was commanded to capture the Erymanthian Boar, a monstrous beast that terrorized the countryside around Mount Erymanthus in Arcadia. This was no ordinary wild pig, but a creature of enormous size and ferocity. Its tusks were as long and sharp as swords, capable of goring a man with a single thrust. Its bristled hide was thick and tough, offering natural protection against weapons. The boar's strength was legendary, It could uproot trees and devastate entire fields in a single night. Most fearsome of all was its unpredictable temperament, for it would charge without warning, driven by a seemingly inexhaustible rage that knew no season or reason. The farmers and shepherds of Arcadia lived in constant fear of the beast. They could only watch helplessly as their carefully tended crops were destroyed and their livestock slaughtered. Many hunters had attempted to kill or capture the Erymanthian boar, but all had either fled in terror or met a grim fate at the end of those deadly tusks. Heracles approached this labor with careful consideration. Unlike the Nemean Lion or the Lernaean Hydra, the boar was not an unnatural monster, but rather an extraordinarily powerful wild animal. And unlike the Ceryneian Hind, it was not sacred to any deity, meaning Heracles could approach its capture by whatever means necessary. Before setting out for Mount Erymanthus, Heracles prepared himself thoroughly. He sharpened his weapons, though he hoped to capture the beast alive rather than kill it. He carried with him strong ropes woven from the toughest fibers, which he would need to bind the creature once subdued. The journey to Arcadia took Heracles through some of the most beautiful landscapes of Greece. Rolling hills covered in olive groves, valleys lush with wildflowers, and clear streams flowing from the mountains. As he traveled, he gathered information from local inhabitants about the boar's habits and territory, building a mental map of where the creature might be found. During his journey, Heracles came to the land of the centaurs, beings that were half human and half horse. There, he visited his old friend Pholus, a centaur known for his wisdom and hospitality. Pholus welcomed Heracles warmly, offering him shelter and a meal after his long travel. As they sat together in Pholus's cave, the centaur offered Heracles wine from a special jar, a jar of extraordinarily potent wine that had been a gift to the centaurs from Diomedes himself, the god of wine. The jar had remained sealed, as it was meant to be opened only on a special occasion. The rich aroma of the wine soon spread beyond the cave, reaching the sensitive nostrils of other centaurs in the vicinity. Drawn by the scent of the divine wine, a group of them galloped to Pholus's cave, angry that the precious gift was being consumed without them. Unlike Pholus, who was civilized and gentle, these centaurs were wild and easily inflamed by alcohol. A violent confrontation ensued. The intoxicated centaurs, their judgment clouded by the divine wine, attacked Heracles with rocks and uprooted trees. Some versions of the tale say they were further enraged because the wine should have been properly mixed with water, as was the Greek custom, but was instead consumed straight, a practice considered barbaric. Heracles defended himself with his usual valor, using his bow to drive back the attackers. His arrows, still poisoned with the venom of the Hydra from his second labor, caused terrible wounds. Even a slight scratch from these arrows would bring excruciating pain and eventually death. In the chaos, several centaurs were wounded or killed, including the famous centaur Chiron, who was respected by gods and mortals alike for his wisdom and knowledge of medicine. Though Chiron was immortal, the Hydra's venom caused him such unbearable pain that he eventually chose to give up his immortality, allowing himself to die rather than suffer eternally. Zeus honored Chiron by placing him among the stars as the constellation Centaurus. Meanwhile, poor Pholus, who had meant no harm in sharing the wine with his friend, accidentally dropped one of Heracles' poisoned arrows. The arrow pierced his foot, and the gentle centaur died from the powerful venom. Heracles, deeply saddened by the unintended consequences of his visit, buried his friend with full honors before continuing his quest. This tragic interlude steeled Heracles' determination to complete his labor and return to his path of redemption. With renewed focus, he ascended Mount Erymanthus, following the trail of destruction left by the wild boar, broken trees, trampled undergrowth, and churned earth where the creature had rooted for food. The mountain was rugged and steep, its slopes covered with dense forests of pine and oak. As Heracles climbed higher, the air grew colder and the vegetation more sparse. Winter still held the upper mountain in its grip, with snow covering the ground despite the spring warmth in the valleys below. It was in this snowy landscape that Heracles finally found signs of his quarry, massive hoof prints in the snow, and areas where the boar had been digging through the frozen ground to find roots and tubers. Following these signs, Heracles moved carefully, using the cover of the trees to mask his approach. Near the summit, he spotted his target, an enormous boar with tusks as long as a man's forearm, its bristled hide dusted with snow as it foraged at the edge of a clearing. Even from a distance, Heracles could see that the tales had not exaggerated the creature's size or ferocity. This was truly a beast worthy of his attention. Rather than attacking immediately, Heracles observed the boar, studying its movements and behavior. He noticed that despite its bulk, the animal was surprisingly quick, with sharp senses that would make a direct assault difficult. A different strategy would be required. Drawing on the wisdom gained from his previous labors, Heracles devised a plan based on the boar's nature and the environment. He began by making his presence known, shouting and breaking branches to attract the beast's attention. The boar, territorial and aggressive, immediately charged toward the source of the disturbance. Heracles led the enraged animal on a chase up the mountainside, always staying just out of reach of those deadly tusks. The snow grew deeper as they ascended, hampering the boar's progress more than it did the light-footed hero. The boar's strength was impressive, but it lacked endurance, especially in the thin mountain air and deep snow. Higher and higher they went, until they reached a plateau near the summit where the snow lay thickest. Here the boar began to tire, its powerful legs sinking deep into the drifts with each step, its breath coming in steaming gasps in the cold air. Still it pursued Heracles, driven by blind rage, even as its strength flagged. Heracles continued to evade the increasingly exhausted animal, leading it in circles until it could barely move through the deep snow. When the boar finally collapsed from exhaustion, Heracles approached cautiously. Though tired, the creature was still dangerous, capable of a sudden burst of energy if it felt cornered. With swift, sure movements, Heracles threw his specially prepared ropes around the boar, binding its legs and snout before it could recover enough to resist. The beast struggled against its bonds, but Heracles' knots held firm. The Erymanthian Boar, terror of Arcadia, had been captured alive. The most difficult part of the labor still lay ahead, transporting the enormous, struggling animal back to Mycenae. Heracles fashioned a sturdy wooden frame, securing the bound boar to it in a way that restricted its movement without causing unnecessary suffering. Then, with the impressive strength for which he was renowned, he hoisted the entire construction onto his shoulders and began the long journey back. The return journey was arduous. The boar, though restrained, was still heavy and constantly tried to break free. Heracles had to stop frequently to reinforce the bindings and rest his muscles. Villages along the way emptied as he passed, the inhabitants watching from a safe distance as the hero transported the dreaded boar that had plagued their region for so long. When at last Heracles arrived at the palace of Eurystheus in Mycenae, the king's reaction was both predictable and comical. At the sight of the enormous bound boar, still very much alive and snorting with rage, Eurystheus fled in terror, taking refuge in a large bronze storage jar, the same one he had hidden in when Heracles returned with the Nemean Lion's skin. From the safety of his bronze refuge, the king's muffled voice ordered Heracles to take the boar away immediately. Heracles, suppressing a smile at the king's cowardice, asked what should be done with the captured beast. After some deliberation, conducted entirely from within the jar, Eurystheus decreed that the boar should be released far from Mycenae, where it could no longer terrorize the people. Heracles complied, taking the boar to a remote wilderness area and setting it free. Some versions of the tale say he released it in the wilds of Thrace, others that he returned it to Arcadia, but to a remote, uninhabited region where it would not encounter farmers or villagers. With the completion of this fourth labor, Heracles had demonstrated yet another facet of his heroism. The defeat of the Nemean Lion had proven his courage, the slaying of the Hydra, his strategic thinking, the capture of the Ceryneian Hind, his patience and reverence for the divine, and now the capture of the Erymanthian Boar showed his resourcefulness and ability to use an opponent's strength against itself. Each labor completed brought Heracles one step closer to his redemption, yet 8 more tasks still awaited him, each seemingly more impossible than the last. But for now, as the sun set over the hills of Mycenae, the hero took a moment to rest, knowing that he had once again succeeded where all others had failed. And as you drift toward the edges of sleep, imagine Heracles sitting before a simple campfire, tending to his weapons and planning for the challenges ahead. For his next labor would take him not to battle a single beast, but to cleanse the stables of King Augeas, a task of different nature but equal difficulty, requiring both strength and ingenuity to overcome. After successfully capturing the Erymanthian Boar, Heracles returned to Mycenae to receive his 5th task from King Eurystheus. The king, still determined to find a labor that would defeat or humiliate the hero, devised a challenge quite different from the previous 4. This time, Heracles would face not a deadly monster or an elusive divine creature, but a task of overwhelming filth and degradation. Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas in a single day. To understand the magnitude of this seemingly mundane task, one must know the extraordinary nature of these stables. Augeas, king of Elis, was renowned for his vast wealth and particularly for his magnificent herds of cattle. He possessed more cattle than any other ruler in Greece, some say 3,000 oxen, and among them were immortal beasts gifted to him by his father, the sun god Helios. These immortal cattle were blessed with perfect health and extraordinary fertility, multiplying the size of Augeas's herds year after year. The king's wealth grew with his herds, but so too did a significant problem. The stables where these countless animals were kept had not been cleaned in 30 years, resulting in mountains of manure and filth that had accumulated to truly monstrous proportions. The stench from these neglected stables had become so powerful that it carried for miles on the wind, sickening the nearby population and rendering the surrounding lands virtually uninhabitable. The task of cleaning this decades old filth was considered impossible. No army of men could hope to accomplish it in a reasonable amount of time, let alone a single day. Eurystheus assigned this labor to Heracles, not because it required the hero's legendary strength, but because he believed it would humiliate the proud son of Zeus. To touch such filth, to wade through the accumulated waste of thousands of cattle, was beneath the dignity of any hero, much less one of Heracles' stature. The king expected either Heracles' refusal or his failure, either of which would diminish his reputation. Heracles, however, approached this challenge as he had all others, with careful thought and determination. He traveled to Elis, the western region of the Peloponnese where Augeas ruled, and presented himself to the king. Augeas received Heracles with the respect due to a famous hero, though with some skepticism when he heard the purpose of his visit. The king had little interest in cleaning his stables. The matter of their condition had long ceased to concern him, as he lived far enough away from them to avoid the worst effects. Seeing an opportunity, Heracles made a proposal to King Augeas. "I will clean your stables completely in a single day, removing every trace of filth and waste. In return, you will give me 1/10 of your magnificent cattle." Augeas laughed at what seemed an impossible boast. 1/10 of his herds represented substantial wealth, but he considered it a safe wager against a task that could not be completed. With witnesses present, including the king's son Phyleus, Augeas agreed to Heracles' terms. The following morning, Heracles surveyed the stables, assessing the immensity of the task before him. The buildings stretched across acres of land, housing thousands of cattle in conditions that had deteriorated beyond description. Decades of accumulated waste had hardened into small mountains within and around the structures. No amount of conventional labor, even with his divine strength, would allow Heracles to clear this filth within a day. But Heracles was more than just strength. He possessed the quick intellect and problem-solving abilities that had served him well in his previous labors. Studying the landscape around the stables, he noticed two rivers flowing nearby, the Alpheus and the Peneus. These powerful rivers, the largest in the region, could become his tools. Instead of attempting to shovel the waste manually, Heracles conceived an ambitious plan to harness the force of nature itself. First, he created openings in the walls of the stables on the side facing away from the rivers. Then, with his immense strength, he dug trenches leading from the rivers to the stables, slightly altering their courses. The most challenging part of the plan required Heracles to temporarily dam sections of the rivers, building up the water pressure. For this, he moved massive boulders into position, creating strong but temporary barriers that would direct the flow exactly where he needed it. With his preparations complete, Heracles removed the dams in a calculated sequence. The powerful rivers, finding their new channels, rushed toward the stables with tremendous force. Water surged through the buildings, flushing away decades of filth in a single, sustained torrent. The waste was carried out through the openings, Heracles had created on the far side, washing away from populated areas and eventually depositing it far downstream where it would decompose naturally and fertilize barren lands. The roar of the rushing water could be heard for miles around, drawing curious onlookers who watched in amazement as the impossible task was accomplished before their eyes. By redirecting the rivers, Heracles had turned a labor that might have taken years into one completed in hours. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the stables of King Augeas stood clean for the first time in 3 decades, water still dripping from the freshly washed stone and wood. Heracles then took one additional step, demonstrating his thoroughness and attention to detail. He redirected the rivers back to their natural courses, ensuring that the ecological balance of the region would not be permanently disrupted by his solution. Proud of his accomplishment, Heracles returned to King Augeas to claim his reward, 1/10 of the cattle, as agreed. But the king, having heard how Heracles had accomplished the feat, refused to honor their agreement. "You cleaned the stables by trickery, not by labor," Augeas declared. "You used the rivers to do your work for you. That was not our bargain." "I used my mind as well as my strength," Heracles countered. "The method does not matter, only the result. The stables are clean, as I promised they would be." The debate grew heated, with neither side willing to yield. It was then that Phyleus, the king's own son, stepped forward to support Heracles' claim, testifying that his father had indeed agreed to the terms. Enraged by this perceived betrayal, Augeas banished both Heracles and his own son from Elis. Heracles departed, denied his rightful payment, but having completed the labor nonetheless. Phyleus, for his honesty, was forced to leave his homeland, though legends say he would later return when Heracles came back to Elis to exact revenge on the deceitful king. When Heracles reported the completion of his 5th labor to King Eurystheus, the king declared that this task would not count toward the required 10. His reasoning was twofold. First, that Heracles had attempted to receive payment for the work, making it a commercial transaction rather than a labor of penance. And second, that Heracles had not actually done the cleaning himself, but had let the rivers do the work for him. This ruling was unjust, but consistent with Eurystheus's pattern of trying to extend Heracles' servitude by any means possible. As with the disqualification of the Hydra labor, Heracles accepted the decision without open complaint, though his private thoughts on the matter can well be imagined. The cleaning of the Augean Stables, while perhaps lacking the drama of battles with monstrous creatures, demonstrated Heracles' problem-solving abilities and resourcefulness. Where brute force alone would have failed, the application of intelligence and natural principles succeeded. This labor also showed that even the most unpleasant and seemingly impossible tasks could be overcome with creative thinking. There is a deeper meaning to this labor as well, one that resonated with ancient audiences and still speaks to us today. The stables represented corruption and neglect that had been allowed to fester for generations. Heracles' cleansing was not just physical, but symbolic, a sweeping away of the old, stagnant order to make way for renewal and fresh beginnings. The aftermath of this labor contained its own irony. Years later, after completing all of his assigned tasks, Heracles would return to Elis with an army. He defeated Augeas in battle, slew him for his dishonesty, and restored Phyleus to the throne as the new king. Heracles then took the payment he was owed, using it to establish the Olympic Games in honor of his father Zeus. Thus, from a labor intended to humiliate him came one of his most lasting and celebrated contributions to Greek culture. For now, though, 5 labors lay behind Heracles, with 7 more ahead. Each challenge had tested different aspects of his character: his courage, his strategic thinking, his patience, his resourcefulness, and now his problem solving abilities. Each had been designed to defeat or break him, yet from each he had emerged victorious, his legend growing with every success. As the hero departed Elis, his thoughts turned to what awaited him next. King Eurystheus, increasingly desperate to find a task that would prove too much for Heracles, was delving deeper into the monstrous and the mythical for inspiration. The 6th labor would take Heracles to the shores of Lake Stymphalia, where creatures of bronze and terror awaited, the infamous Stymphalian Birds, whose very feathers were deadly weapons. As your consciousness begins to drift toward sleep, imagine Heracles walking the roads of ancient Greece, the sun setting behind him, casting his long shadow ahead. His expression is resolute, his stride purposeful. 5 labors complete, 7 yet to come. The path of redemption is long and fraught with danger, but with each step he moves closer to his destiny, not just as a hero, but as a legend whose name would echo through the ages. Having completed his 5th labor, though without receiving credit for it from the devious Eurystheus, Heracles soon found himself assigned a 6th task. This time, the hero was ordered to drive away the Stymphalian Birds, fearsome creatures that plagued the woods surrounding Lake Stymphalus in Arcadia. These were no ordinary birds. According to the tales told in hushed voices by those who had glimpsed them and survived, the Stymphalian Birds possessed metallic feathers, sharp as finely honed daggers, beaks of bronze that could pierce armor, and talons that could tear through the toughest hide. Some accounts claimed they were sacred to Ares, the god of war, bred for violence and aggression. The birds had multiplied in great numbers, making their home in the thick, dark forest that encircled Lake Stymphalus. From this protected sanctuary, they would emerge to terrorize the surrounding countryside, attacking livestock and humans alike with their razor-sharp plumage. They would sometimes take flight in such dense flocks that they blocked out the sun, raining down their metallic feathers like deadly arrows upon those unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them. More troubling still were reports that these birds fed on human flesh, deliberately hunting people who ventured too close to their territory. The once prosperous region around Lake Stymphalus had been largely abandoned, its farms and villages left to ruin as the local population fled the avian terrors. When Heracles reached the vicinity of Lake Stymphalus, he immediately understood the difficulty of his task. The lake itself was surrounded by a dense, primeval forest with thick undergrowth, ideal terrain for the birds to hide in, and difficult for any warrior to navigate. Even if he could enter the woods, the canopy above was so thick that visibility was severely limited, making it nearly impossible to track or target the birds. For several days, Heracles scouted the perimeter of the forest, observing from a safe distance. Occasionally, he would catch glimpses of the birds as they took flight above the trees or swooped down to the lake's surface to drink. They were indeed fearsome creatures, larger than eagles, with gleaming metallic plumage that flashed in the sunlight. Their movements were swift and precise, and their harsh, metallic cries echoed across the water, sending shivers down the spines of all who heard them. Heracles soon realized that conventional hunting methods would be ineffective against such numerous and dangerous prey in such difficult terrain. He could not simply march into the forest and begin shooting arrows at the birds. They would attack him from all sides, overwhelming him with their numbers before he could make a meaningful impact on their population. He needed a different approach, a way to drive them all out of the forest at once, where they would be vulnerable. As he pondered this problem, Heracles received divine assistance. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, who had aided him in previous labors, appeared before him. She carried with her a pair of bronze crotala, special castanet like noisemakers crafted by Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith. These birds fear loud, discordant sounds, Athena explained. Their metallic nature makes them particularly sensitive to certain vibrations. Use these to drive them from their hiding places, and then your skill with the bow will do the rest. Thanking the goddess for her aid, Heracles took the bronze crotala and climbed to the top of a hill overlooking the lake and forest. When he reached a position with good visibility of the open sky above the trees, he began to shake the divine instruments. The sound they produced was extraordinary, a piercing, rattling noise that seemed to reverberate through the very air, magnified by Hephaestus's divine craftsmanship. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Stymphalian birds, disturbed by the sound that was painful to their unique senses, burst from the cover of the trees in a great metallic cloud. Thousands of them took to the air at once, their wings creating a sound like a tremendous storm as they circled in confusion, trying to escape the painful noise. Seizing his opportunity, Heracles laid aside the crotala and took up his bow. With the deadly accuracy for which he was renowned, he began to fire arrows into the mass of birds wheeling above the lake. Each arrow found its mark, bringing down multiple birds with a single shot as the bronze-tipped missiles passed through one bird and into another. The sky rained metal as the birds fell, their feathers clattering against each other and the ground below. Some accounts say that Heracles used special arrows for this labor, perhaps tipped with the poison of the Hydra, or designed by Hephaestus to seek multiple targets. Others suggest that the arrows were ordinary, but Heracles' extraordinary skill made each shot count for many. Not all the birds fell to Heracles' arrows. Many fled, driven away by the sound of the crotala and the sight of their fellows falling from the sky. These scattered in all directions, never to return to Lake Stymphalus. Some tales suggest they flew as far as the Black Sea, establishing themselves on an island sacred to Ares, where they would later be encountered by Jason and the Argonauts. For an entire day, Heracles continued his assault, shooting down birds and driving away the survivors until the sky above Lake Stymphalus was clear once more. The forest floor was littered with fallen birds, their metallic feathers glinting in the patches of sunlight that now reached through the canopy unobstructed. The local people, who had watched the battle from the safety of distant hills, slowly approached in wonder and gratitude. They collected the metallic feathers, beaks, and talons of the fallen birds, discovering that these could be forged into exceptional weapons and tools. In this way, the very creatures that had terrorized them became a source of wealth and protection. Heracles, having assured himself that the threat was eliminated or driven far away, collected several of the birds as proof of his accomplishment. Their distinctive metallic nature made them unlike any other creature, and even King Eurystheus would not be able to deny the completion of this labor. The journey back to Mycenae was uneventful, a welcome respite after the intensity of the battle with the Stymphalian birds. Along the way, Heracles was greeted as a savior by villagers who had heard of his deed, many of whom had relatives or trading partners in the Stymphalus region who could now return to their abandoned homes and fields. When he arrived at Mycenae, Heracles presented his trophies to King Eurystheus. The king, who had expected this labor to defeat the hero, was visibly disappointed to see him return victorious once again. Examining the metallic birds with reluctant fascination, Eurystheus could find no reason to reject this labor as he had with the Hydra and the Augean Stables. Grudgingly, he acknowledged that Heracles had successfully completed his sixth task. The defeat of the Stymphalian birds represented yet another facet of Heracles' heroism. Unlike the raw courage required to face the Nemean Lion or the strategic thinking needed to defeat the Hydra, this labor showcased Heracles' willingness to accept divine aid and to adapt his tactics to the unique nature of each challenge. Though his strength and skill with weapons remained central to his success, it was his wisdom in applying these attributes appropriately that truly distinguished him as a hero. The clearing of the birds from Lake Stymphalus had significant positive effects beyond the immediate safety of the local population. The region, once abandoned due to the avian terror, could now be resettled. Farms were reestablished, villages rebuilt, and trade routes reopened. The lake itself, no longer dominated by the flesh-eating birds, became a valuable fishing ground. Some interpretations of this myth suggest a deeper meaning. The Stymphalian birds, with their metallic nature and connection to Ares, might represent the horrors of war, sudden, violent, and indiscriminate in their destruction. Heracles driving them away could symbolize the establishment of peace and order, allowing civilization to flourish once more. Others see in this labor a representation of environmental balance. The birds, having overpopulated their habitat and become destructive, needed to be culled to restore natural harmony. Heracles, acting as an agent of both human civilization and natural order, removed the threat without eliminating the species entirely. Those birds that escaped would establish new colonies elsewhere, where perhaps they would find a more balanced relationship with their surroundings. For Heracles himself, the completion of his sixth labor meant he was halfway through his assigned penance. 6 labors lay behind him, 6 more ahead. With each task completed, he moved closer to his redemption and the purification of his spirit from the terrible deed that had set him on this path. As twilight fell over Greece and Heracles made camp for the night, perhaps he took a moment to reflect on the journey thus far. From the Nemean Lion to the Stymphalian Birds, each labor had tested him in different ways. Each victory had taught him something new about himself and the world. Though the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, with challenges yet unknown awaiting him, the hero could take pride in how far he had already come. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, constellations that would one day include Heracles himself among them. For now, though, his place was on earth, among mortals, continuing his labors. As he gazed into his campfire, the flames might have reminded him of his next destination, the island of Crete, where the Cretan Bull awaited, a creature of divine origin whose capture would form his seventh labor. As your own consciousness begins to drift toward sleep, imagine the hero resting beneath the stars of ancient Greece, his legendary journey only half complete, his greatest challenges and triumphs still to come. In the warm embrace of slumber, you might glimpse in dreams what awaits Heracles next, the snorting, stamping power of the Cretan bull, a beast born of the sea and blessed by Poseidon himself, now running wild across that storied island. The seventh labor assigned to Heracles took him across the wine-dark sea to Crete, the largest of the Greek islands and home to one of the oldest civilizations in the Mediterranean world. His task was to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent but dangerous creature that was ravaging the island. This was no ordinary bull, but a beast of divine origin with a complex history entwined with the royal house of Crete. The story began years earlier when King Minos, son of Zeus and Europa, competed with his brothers for the throne of Crete. To prove his divine right to rule, Minos prayed to Poseidon, god of the sea, asking for a sign of favor. The god answered by sending a magnificent white bull from the depths of the sea, with the understanding that Minos would sacrifice the animal back to Poseidon in gratitude. The bull was so beautiful, with its gleaming coat and powerful form, that Minos could not bear to kill it. Instead, he sacrificed a lesser bull and kept the divine creature for his own herds. This deception angered Poseidon, who punished Minos by inflicting an unnatural passion upon his wife, Queen Pasiphae. The queen's subsequent union with the bull resulted in the birth of the Minotaur, the monstrous half-man, half-bull that would later be confined in the labyrinth. As for the bull itself, Poseidon drove it mad, causing it to rampage across Crete, destroying crops, demolishing villages, and terrorizing the people. No ordinary huntsman or warrior could subdue it, for along with its divine strength and ferocity, the bull could breathe fire according to some accounts. King Minos, despite his considerable power, found himself helpless against the very creature he had once coveted. This, then, was the target of Heracles' seventh labor, a divine bull, maddened by a god's wrath that had been causing destruction across Crete for years. The challenge was not just to kill the beast, but to capture it alive and bring it back to King Eurystheus in Mycenae. Heracles made the sea voyage to Crete with mixed emotions. On one hand, he welcomed the opportunity to visit the storied island with its ancient palaces and sophisticated culture. On the other, he knew that capturing a rampaging bull without killing it would require even more finesse than his previous labors. Upon arriving at Knossos, the capital city of Crete, with its magnificent palace complex, Heracles sought an audience with King Minos. The aging king received the hero with proper respect, well aware of Heracles' divine parentage and legendary accomplishments. When Heracles explained the purpose of his visit, Minos readily granted permission to capture the bull. "Take the cursed beast," Minos told him, "and rid my island of its destruction. I care not what becomes of it afterward." Some accounts suggest that Minos' daughter Ariadne, the same who would later help Theseus defeat the Minotaur, provided Heracles with information about the bull's habits and likely locations. Others say that the hero tracked the bull entirely on his own, following the trail of devastation it had left across the landscape. Crete, with its varied terrain of mountains, fertile plains, and coastal areas, offered many places for the bull to roam. Heracles began his search in the central plains, where the creature had most recently been sighted. The evidence of its passage was unmistakable: trampled fields, uprooted olive trees, and the charred remains of anything that had provoked its fiery breath. For several days, Heracles tracked the bull, always seeming to arrive shortly after it had moved on. He spoke with terrified farmers and shepherds who had glimpsed the creature, gradually building a picture of its movement patterns and behavior. The bull, he learned, was most active at dawn and dusk and seemed to favor areas near sources of fresh water. Finally, as the sun was setting behind Mount Ida, casting long shadows across the landscape, Heracles caught sight of his quarry. The bull stood at the edge of a small lake, its white coat glowing in the fading light. It was even larger than he had imagined, with massive shoulders and powerful legs that ended in hooves that could crush a man's skull. Its horns curved upward like twin scimitars, and steam occasionally issued from its flared nostrils. Heracles observed the bull carefully, noting how it surveyed its surroundings before lowering its head to drink. This was clearly not just a maddened beast, but a cunning one, aware of potential threats and cautious despite its tremendous strength. A direct approach would likely send it charging or fleeing, neither of which would help Heracles complete his task. Drawing on his experience from previous labors, Heracles devised a strategy. He would not attempt to overpower the bull immediately, but would first demonstrate his own strength in a way that might give the creature pause. Moving into the open where the bull could clearly see him, Heracles uprooted a small olive tree with his bare hands, then casually tossed aside a boulder that would have required several ordinary men to move. The bull, startled by the sudden appearance of a human, but intrigued by the display of strength, snorted and pawed the ground. It lowered its horns threateningly, but did not immediately charge. This hesitation gave Heracles the opportunity he needed to continue his approach, moving steadily but non-aggressively toward the magnificent beast. When the distance between them had narrowed to less than 20 paces, the bull's patience ended. With a bellow that echoed across the valley, it charged directly at Heracles, its hooves thundering against the earth, its horns aimed at the hero's chest. Instead of dodging to the side, as most men would have done, Heracles stood his ground. At the last possible moment, he sidestepped just enough to avoid the horns, while reaching out to grasp them with his mighty hands. The bull's momentum carried it forward, but Heracles' strength was sufficient to redirect its charge. What followed was a contest unlike any other, man against beast, divine strength against divine creation. The bull twisted and thrashed, trying to gore Heracles with its deadly horns or crush him beneath its hooves. Heracles held fast, gradually exerting control over the creature's movements while avoiding its most dangerous attacks. The struggle continued for hours, with neither giving quarter. The bull, despite its divine nature and Poseidon's madness, began to tire before Heracles did. The hero's endurance, enhanced by his partial divinity, allowed him to maintain his grip even as sweat poured down his body and his muscles screamed for relief. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, Heracles made his final move. With precise timing, he shifted his grip from the bull's horns to its neck, applying pressure to specific points that would not injure the creature, but would temporarily render it docile. This technique, learned during his many adventures, allowed him to subdue the powerful animal without causing it lasting harm. The bull, finally conquered, sank to its knees on the lakeshore. While it was in this subdued state, Heracles quickly fashioned restraints from sturdy vines and leather straps he had prepared. He bound the bull securely but not cruelly, ensuring it could breathe comfortably and move enough to maintain its balance. Leading his captive back toward Knossos, Heracles encountered amazed villagers who could scarcely believe the sight of the dreaded bull walking peacefully beside the hero. Word spread quickly, and by the time he reached the palace, a considerable crowd had gathered to witness this marvel. King Minos, too, came out to see the subdued beast that had caused his kingdom so much anguish. Some accounts suggest that the king experienced a moment of regret, remembering the bull's arrival as a divine gift and his own fateful decision to keep it. Other versions claim that Minos offered Heracles great treasures in gratitude, which the hero declined, explaining that his labor was for Eurystheus alone. With the permission of King Minos secured, Heracles prepared for the journey back to the mainland. This presented another challenge: how to transport a massive bull across the sea. Heracles commissioned a special vessel, reinforced to hold the weight of the creature and designed with barriers to prevent it from moving about too freely during the voyage. The sea journey proved almost as challenging as the capture itself. Poseidon, still harboring resentment over Minos's deception, sent rough seas and contrary winds to hinder their progress. Some tellings of the myth describe how Heracles was forced to calm the bull during violent storms, his soothing words and firm hand preventing the frightened animal from capsizing their vessel. Despite these difficulties, Heracles eventually reached the shores of the Peloponnese with his prize intact. The final leg of the journey took him overland to Mycenae, leading the still restrained bull through villages and countryside. Farmers stopped their work to stare, and children ran alongside at a safe distance, marveling at the massive creature and its famous captor. When Heracles arrived at the palace of Eurystheus, the sight of the Cretan bull caused the king to once again retreat to his bronze pythos, the large jar that had become his habitual hiding place whenever Heracles returned with a particularly dangerous conquest. From this safe vantage point, Eurystheus examined the bull, and finding no reason to disqualify this labor, acknowledged Heracles' success. As for the fate of the Cretan bull, accounts differ. Some say that Eurystheus, after his initial fear subsided, ordered the bull released, consecrating it to Hera. The goddess, still harboring her ancient hatred for Heracles, drove the creature mad once more, causing it to wander into the countryside around Marathon. There it would continue to cause havoc until eventually being slain by Theseus, creating another link between the heroic cycles of Greek mythology. Other versions suggest that Eurystheus sacrificed the bull to Athena or Apollo, while some claim that the bull escaped on its own, roaming free until it met its end elsewhere. Whatever its ultimate fate, the Cretan bull had served its purpose in Heracles' labors, demonstrating once again the hero's extraordinary capabilities. This seventh labor illustrated yet another aspect of Heracles' heroism. Beyond the courage, strategic thinking, patience, resourcefulness, and problem-solving abilities shown in previous tasks, the capture of the Cretan bull highlighted his capacity for measured strength. the ability to subdue without destroying, to control his immense power with precision rather than brute force. As night deepens around you and sleep grows nearer, imagine Heracles leading the magnificent white bull across the plains of Greece, the setting sun glinting off its coat and horns. 7 labors now complete, 5 yet to come. The hero's path of redemption continues, each challenge bringing him closer to absolution for the tragic deed that began his journey. His next labor would take him north to Thrace, to face not a single beast, but 4 man-eating horses owned by King Diomedes, creatures as vicious as their master, fed on human flesh and wild with bloodlust. But that is a tale for another night, another dream, as you drift now into the peaceful realms of slumber. For his 8th labor, Heracles was sent on a journey to the distant land of Thrace, a wild and rugged region north of Greece, known for its fierce warriors and harsh landscapes. His task was to capture the mares of Diomedes, king of the Bistones, a tribe of Thracians notorious for their cruelty and battle prowess. These were no ordinary horses. The mares were 4 in number, named Podargos, the Swift, Lampon, the Shining, Xanthos, the Blonde, and Dinos, the Terrible. They were magnificent beasts of extraordinary size and strength, with coats that gleamed like burnished metal in the sunlight. But their beauty belied their terrible nature, for these mares had been trained by their master to feed on human flesh. King Diomedes, son of Ares the war god, took perverse pleasure in feeding unwary travelers and captured enemies to his horses. This diet of human flesh had made the mares savage beyond belief, their eyes burning with an unnatural hunger, their powerful jaws capable of tearing through armor and bone with equal ease. Iron chains were required to restrain them, and only Diomedes and his most trusted men dared to approach the beasts. The reputation of these man-eating horses had spread far and wide, adding to the fearsome image of Thrace as a land of danger and barbarity. Travelers gave the kingdom of the Bistones a wide berth, and neighboring tribes lived in constant fear of Diomedes's raids, which served the dual purpose of expanding his territory and providing fresh food for his monstrous steeds. When Eurystheus assigned this labor to Heracles, he surely believed he was sending the hero to his doom. Even if Heracles could defeat the mares, he would still have to contend with Diomedes and his warriors, deep in their own territory, where they held every advantage. Heracles approached this challenge with his customary thoroughness. He knew that this labor would require not just strength and courage, but careful planning and possibly allies. Before setting out for Thrace, he assembled a group of willing companions, brave men who had either fought alongside him in previous adventures or who sought to earn glory by aiding the famous hero. Among these companions was Abderus, a young man of exceptional beauty and courage who had become particularly dear to Heracles. Some accounts describe him as the hero's squire, others as a close friend, but all agree on his loyalty and bravery. He would play a significant role in the events that followed, though not in the way anyone expected. The journey to Thrace was long and arduous, taking Heracles and his companions through diverse lands and exposing them to various dangers. They traveled by ship along the coast of the Aegean Sea, then proceeded overland through Macedonia and into the rough hill country of Thrace itself. Everywhere they went, Heracles' reputation preceded him, and they were generally received with hospitality and respect. As they approached the territory of the Bistones, however, the attitude of the local people changed markedly. Villages appeared abandoned, with inhabitants hiding at the approach of strangers. Those few who would speak to Heracles and his party did so in fearful whispers, warning them to turn back before they met the fate of so many others, becoming fodder for Diomedes' monstrous horses. Heracles pressed on, undeterred by these warnings. Through careful questioning of the locals, he learned the location of Diomedes' stronghold and the stables where the flesh-eating mares were kept. He also gathered valuable information about the king's habits, the strength of his forces, and the layout of his fortress. Upon reaching the vicinity of Diomedes' realm, Heracles decided on a strategy. Rather than announcing his presence and purpose, which would certainly put Diomedes on alert, he would approach the stables under cover of darkness and attempt to steal the mares while their master slept. It was not his usual method. Heracles generally preferred direct confrontation, but in this case, stealth seemed the wiser course. That night, leaving most of his companions hidden in a sheltered valley, Heracles took Abderus and a few others and made his way toward the royal stables. The building was heavily guarded, but the sentries were unprepared for the silent efficiency with which Heracles and his men dispatched them. Inside the stables, the mares were chained to bronze mangers, their massive forms restless even in the depths of night. They sensed the approach of strangers and began to stamp and snort, pulling at their restraints with tremendous force. The noise threatened to alert the rest of Diomedes' men, forcing Heracles to act quickly. With his incredible strength, he broke the chains binding the horses and began to lead them out of the stables. The mares, perhaps sensing Heracles' divine bloodline, did not immediately attack him, though they remained dangerously unpredictable, snapping at anyone who came too close. Heracles entrusted the horses to Abderus, instructing him to lead them to the ship waiting on the coast, while he remained behind to deal with any pursuit. This decision, made in haste and necessity, would have tragic consequences. As Heracles had anticipated, the commotion in the stables soon roused the Bistonian warriors. Led by King Diomedes himself, they poured out of the fortress, armed and enraged at the theft of their prized possessions. Heracles found himself facing the full might of the Bistones, with Diomedes at their head. The king was a fearsome sight, clad in black armor, with a helm shaped like a wolf's head, his spear as tall as a young tree. As the son of Ares, he possessed strength and skill in battle far beyond most mortal men. He recognized Heracles immediately and challenged him directly, confident in his ability to defeat even this legendary hero. What followed was one of the most brutal battles of Heracles' many adventures. Diomedes fought with the ferocity of his divine father. His spear and sword, driven by inhuman strength and a lifetime of warfare. Heracles matched him blow for blow, his lion skin turning aside many strikes that would have killed a lesser man, his own club dealing devastating damage whenever it connected with the Thracian king's armor. Around them, the Bistonian warriors clashed with the few men Heracles had brought to the stables. Though outnumbered, Heracles' companions fought bravely, inspired by their leader's example and determined not to shame themselves in his presence. The tide of battle turned when Heracles managed to disarm Diomedes, sending his spear spinning into the darkness. With his bare hands, the hero grappled with the Thracian king, eventually lifting him bodily from the ground and throwing him down with such force that Diomedes could not immediately rise. Seeing their king defeated, many of the Bistones lost heart and began to retreat. Others fought on more desperately, trying to reach their fallen leader. Heracles, seizing the advantage, ordered his men to fall back while he dealt with Diomedes. What happened next is told differently in various accounts. Some say that Heracles slew Diomedes on the spot, crushing him with his club or breaking his bones in a final wrestling match. Others claim that he took the king prisoner, binding him in the same chains that had once held the man-eating mares. The most poetic version of the myth, and the one most often depicted in ancient art, tells that Heracles fed Diomedes to his own horses, a fitting end for a man who had condemned so many innocent travelers to the same fate. In this telling, the flesh-eating mares finally tasted the flesh of their master, bringing the cycle of cruelty to a symmetrical conclusion. Whatever Diomedes' exact fate, Heracles emerged victorious from the encounter. Gathering his surviving companions, he set off to rejoin Abderus and secure the captured mares. It was then that he discovered the tragedy that had occurred in his absence. Abderus, brave but lacking the divine strength of Heracles, had been unable to control the savage horses once they were free of the hero's presence. The mares, their bloodlust aroused by the scent of humans, had turned on the young man and devoured him, leaving only a mangled remains for his friends to find. Heracles was overcome with grief and rage at the loss of his dear companion. In his anger, he might have slain the mares then and there, but he remembered that his labor required him to bring them back to Eurystheus alive. Mastering his emotions through tremendous effort, he determined to complete his task and then honor Abderus's memory appropriately. With renewed determination, Heracles subdued the mares, which had once again become frenzied after tasting human blood. Some versions of the myth say that he temporarily pacified them by feeding them the flesh of Diomedes, sating their hunger with the body of the man who had corrupted them. Others suggest that Heracles found special herbs that, when fed to the horses, temporarily subdued their unnatural craving for human flesh. Before beginning the long journey back to Mycenae, Heracles took time to properly honor Abderus. He buried his friend with all due rites and founded a city at the site, naming it Abdera in memory of the fallen youth. This city would grow to become one of the most important Greek colonies in Thrace, a center of culture and commerce that stood as a lasting monument to Abderus's sacrifice. With the mares secured, Heracles began the journey home. The horses remained dangerous throughout the trip, requiring constant vigilance and exceptional skill to manage. Heracles himself had to guide them, as no one else dared approach the creatures that had so recently claimed the life of Abderus. Upon reaching Mycenae, Heracles presented the 4 mares to King Eurystheus, who was both astonished and terrified by the success of this seemingly impossible labor. The king, unable to find any reason to reject this achievement, was forced to acknowledge that Heracles had completed his 8th labor. What became of the man-eating mares after they were presented to Eurystheus varies in different tellings of the myth. Some accounts claim that Eurystheus dedicated them to Hera, who set them loose in the mountains of northern Greece, where they were eventually killed by wild beasts. Others say that they were allowed to roam free on Mount Olympus, and their descendants are the wild horses that still inhabit the remote mountains of Greece. Perhaps the most interesting version suggests that Eurystheus ordered the mares taken to Mount Olympus and released, but Zeus, displeased by the presence of such unnatural creatures in his sacred domain, sent lions, bears, and wolves to destroy them. In this way, the gods themselves passed final judgment on the monstrous horses and their cruel creator. The eighth labor of Heracles demonstrated once again the multifaceted nature of his heroism. Beyond strength and courage, he showed strategic thinking in his approach to the challenge and profound humanity in his response to the loss of Abderus. The founding of Abdera revealed another side of the hero, his role as a civilizing force, establishing order and culture in the barbaric frontiers of the known world. There is also a moral dimension to this labor that resonated with ancient audiences and still speaks to us today. The fate of Diomedes, consumed by the very instruments of his cruelty, embodies the Greek concept of poetic justice. The tyrant who fed innocents to his horses ultimately became food for them himself, his evil returning upon his own head. As sleep begins to envelop your consciousness, picture Heracles standing on a hill overlooking the newly founded city of Abdera, the afternoon sun warming his face as he pays final tribute to his fallen friend. 8 labors now complete, 4 more await him on his path to redemption. His next challenge would take him to the land of the Amazons, the warrior women whose queen possessed a magical girdle that Eurystheus's daughter coveted, a seemingly simple task of acquisition that would prove far more complex than it first appeared. After the fierce battles and tragic loss that marked his 8th labor, Heracles found himself assigned a task that seemed, at first glance, less dangerous, but potentially more complex. For his 9th labor, King Eurystheus commanded him to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. This request came not from Eurystheus himself, but from his daughter, Admete, a princess with a passion for collecting rare and beautiful objects. Having heard tales of the magnificent girdle worn by the Amazon queen, a gift from Ares, god of war, symbolizing her authority, Admete desired it for her own collection. Her father, ever seeking ways to challenge or destroy Heracles, was happy to indulge her wish. The Amazons were a nation of warrior women who lived beyond the known world, their exact location varying in different tellings of the myth. Some placed them in northern Anatolia, along the shores of the Black Sea, others in the steppes of Scythia, and still others in more distant and exotic lands. What all accounts agreed upon was their nature, women who had rejected traditional female roles to embrace the arts of war, who rode as well as any man and fought with even greater ferocity. Amazon society was the inverse of Greek society. Where Greek women were expected to remain in the home, Amazon women rode freely across the open plains. Where Greek men dominated warfare and politics, Amazon women governed themselves and defended their borders against all comers. They were said to remove their right breasts to better draw their bows, though this detail may have been a Greek misunderstanding of their name, which possibly meant without barley, amaza, indicating their nomadic lifestyle rather than any physical modification. To confront such a society, particularly to take from their queen her sacred symbol of authority, would require a delicate touch as well as strength. Heracles recognized this and prepared accordingly. He assembled a group of heroes to accompany him, including, according to some accounts, his friend Theseus, the great hero of Athens. Then he commissioned a fine ship, similar to the Argo of Jason's fame, and set sail for the distant land of the Amazons. The journey was long and filled with minor adventures. The ship stopped at various ports along the way, where Heracles and his companions were generally welcomed as heroes and treated with appropriate hospitality. In one version of the tale, they stopped at the island of Paros, where two of Heracles' men were killed by the sons of Minos. In retribution, Heracles slew the murderers and threatened to wage war on the entire island until they offered him two men to replace his fallen companions. Eventually, the ship reached the land of the Amazons, anchoring in a natural harbor near their principal settlement. Heracles, wisely choosing diplomacy over immediate conflict, did not arrive in full battle array, but rather as a distinguished visitor seeking audience with the queen. His reputation had preceded him even to these distant shores, and the Amazons were curious about the famous hero whose deeds were celebrated across the known world. Hippolyta, their queen, was particularly intrigued. She was a magnificent figure, tall and powerfully built, with the bearing of one born to lead. Her skill in battle was legendary even among her warrior sisters, and it was for this reason that Ares had gifted her with the beautifully wrought girdle or belt that Heracles now sought. Made of the finest leather and adorned with jewels and gold, it was both a functional piece of armor and a symbol of her divine favor and authority. When Heracles explained the purpose of his visit, being straightforward about his labor and his need to obtain the girdle, Hippolyta did not immediately refuse. She invited him to be her guest, to feast with the Amazons, and to demonstrate his famous strength and skill in their games and training exercises. Heracles accepted, and for several days, a rare atmosphere of mutual respect and cultural exchange prevailed between the Greek heroes and the Amazon warriors. Hippolyta and Heracles had many conversations during this time, each becoming increasingly impressed with the other's intelligence, leadership, and accomplishments. In some versions of the myth, a romantic attachment began to form between them, the warrior queen finding in Heracles a man who could respect her as an equal rather than fear or resent her power. So favorable was the impression Heracles made that Hippolyta eventually agreed to give him her girdle as a gift. This unexpected turn of events seemed to offer a peaceful resolution to Heracles' labor, an outcome based on mutual respect rather than conflict. Fate, however, had other plans, often shaped by the continuing enmity of Hera toward her husband's illegitimate son. Seeing that Heracles was about to complete another labor without bloodshed, the goddess decided to intervene. Taking the form of an Amazon warrior, she moved among the tribes, spreading a dangerous rumor that the foreign visitors planned to abduct their queen and steal their treasures. The Amazons, proud and vigilant, were quick to believe that they had been deceived. While Heracles was preparing to depart with the freely given girdle, he found himself and his companions suddenly surrounded by fully armed Amazon warriors, their expressions no longer welcoming, but filled with fury at his perceived treachery. In the chaos that followed, Hippolyta tried to explain that she had given the girdle willingly, but her voice was lost in the clamor of battle that erupted. Different versions of the myth diverge significantly at this point. In some, Hippolyta is accidentally slain in the fighting, perhaps by Heracles himself, in a tragic misunderstanding. In others, she survives, but is unable to prevent the conflict between her warriors and the Greek heroes. What is consistent across all tellings is that a fierce battle ensued. The Amazons were formidable opponents, their skill in mounted combat and archery making them especially dangerous in their home territory. Heracles and his companions fought defensively at first, trying to reach their ship without causing unnecessary casualties. As the battle intensified, however, Heracles was forced to employ his full might. The hero who had overcome so many monstrous foes now found himself pitted against warriors who, though mortal, were in many ways more formidable because of their human intelligence combined with exceptional training. It was a different kind of challenge than the raw power of the Nemean Lion or the many heads of the Hydra. Eventually, the superior strength and fighting skills of Heracles and his chosen companions began to tell. The Amazons, recognizing that the tide of battle had turned against them, executed a strategic withdrawal, a disciplined maneuver that demonstrated their military sophistication. Heracles, now in possession of the girdle, whether as a gift suddenly reclaimed by conflict or as a trophy of reluctant victory, gathered his men and returned to their ship. They departed swiftly before the Amazons could regroup for another attack. The return journey to Mycenae was marked by mixed emotions. Heracles had completed his task and obtained the girdle, but the price had been higher than he anticipated. What might have been a rare example of peaceful resolution had devolved into yet another battle, with losses on both sides that could have been avoided. Some versions of the myth include additional adventures on the return journey. One notable account tells how the ship stopped at Troy, long before the famous war, where King Laomedon had refused to pay Apollo and Poseidon for building the city walls. As punishment, Poseidon had sent a sea monster to ravage the Trojan shore. Laomedon had chained his daughter Hesione to the rocks as a sacrifice to appease the beast. Heracles, arriving at this critical moment, offered to slay the monster and save Hesione in exchange for Laomedon's divine horses, a gift from Zeus. The king agreed, and Heracles killed the sea monster, freeing the princess. But after the deed was done, Laomedon refused to honor his promise. Heracles, not having sufficient forces to punish this treachery immediately, vowed to return later and take revenge, a promise he would eventually fulfill, sacking Troy and killing Laomedon in a foreshadowing of the city's more famous fall. When Heracles finally returned to Mycenae and presented the Amazon girdle to Eurystheus, the king was forced to acknowledge the completion of the ninth labor. Princess Admete received her coveted prize, adding the belt of Hippolyta to her collection of treasures, perhaps unaware of or unconcerned by the blood that had been shed to obtain it. This ninth labor of Heracles revealed yet another dimension of his character. Unlike his previous tasks, which had pitted him against monsters or forces of nature, this labor required him to navigate complex human interactions and cultural differences. He had attempted diplomacy before resorting to force, showing wisdom as well as strength. The tragic turn of events, instigated by Hera's interference, demonstrated that even the best intentions could be undermined by misunderstanding and suspicion. In this, perhaps, lies a deeper message of the myth, that conflict often arises not from inherent enmity, but from miscommunication and the machinations of those who benefit from discord. For Heracles himself, the adventure with the Amazons may have been particularly significant because it brought him into contact with women who were, in many ways, his equals, warriors and leaders who earned respect through their own achievements rather than through their relationships with men. This encounter with a society so different from his own might have broadened his perspective on the nature of strength and the various forms courage could take. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine Heracles standing at the prow of his ship as it sails homeward, the girdle of Hippolyta secured, but his victory tempered by the knowledge that it had come at a cost he had hoped to avoid. 9 labors now complete, 3 remained before his penance would be fulfilled and his path to redemption complete. His next task would take him to the far western edge of the known world to confront the triple-bodied giant Geryon and steal his magnificent cattle, a journey fraught with obstacles and revelations, where the hero would leave his mark on the very landscape of the Mediterranean world. For his 10th labor, Heracles was given a task that would take him to the very edges of the known world. King Eurystheus commanded him to travel to the island of Erythea, located far in the western ocean beyond the Mediterranean Sea, and steal the cattle of Geryon, a fearsome giant with 3 bodies joined at the waist. Geryon was the grandson of the Gorgon Medusa and the son of Chrysaor and Calirrhoe. His extraordinary physical form, 3 bodies complete with 3 heads, 6 arms, and 6 legs, made him one of the most powerful beings in the mythical world. His cattle were equally remarkable, a herd of magnificent red oxen that were guarded not only by Geryon himself, but also by Orthrus, a 2-headed hound and brother to Cerberus, and a herdsman named Eurytion. This labor presented unique challenges for Heracles. The sheer distance he would need to travel was daunting, taking him far beyond the familiar territories of Greece into lands that were little more than rumors to most mortals. The formidable nature of his adversaries meant that combat would be even more dangerous than usual, and the logistics of capturing and transporting an entire herd of cattle back to Mycenae added a practical dimension to the quest that none of his previous labors had included. Nevertheless, Heracles set out with determination, traveling alone on this quest rather than assembling companions as he had for some previous labors. His journey would become one of the most storied and eventful of all his adventures, with some accounts claiming it took him years to complete, during which time he transformed the very geography of the Mediterranean world. Heracles began by traveling through Greece and into southern Italy, which was then known as Magna Graecia due to the many Greek colonies established there. From there, he continued westward through Sicily and along the northern coast of Africa. Everywhere he went, he encountered challenges and left his mark on the local landscape and mythology. In Libya, the heat of the desert so irritated Heracles that he reportedly shot an arrow at the sun in defiance. The sun god Helios, impressed by his boldness rather than offended, offered Heracles the use of a magical golden cup, or boat, in which Helios himself sailed across the ocean each night after the sun set in the west. Heracles gratefully accepted this divine aid, using the vessel to navigate the vast ocean waters that separated the eastern Mediterranean from the distant island of Erythea. Upon reaching Erythea, located somewhere beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in what is now the Atlantic Ocean, Heracles was immediately confronted by Orthrus, the 2-headed watchdog. This fearsome beast, brother to the more famous Cerberus that guarded the underworld, charged at Heracles with savage fury. The hero, drawing on his experience from previous labors, swiftly dispatched Orthrus with a powerful blow from his club. Next came Eurytion, the herdsman, who rushed to defend his charges upon hearing the commotion. Despite being a skilled fighter, Eurytion was no match for Heracles, who overcame him as easily as he had Orthrus. With both guardians defeated, Heracles began to gather the red cattle, preparing to drive them away from their pastures. It was then that Geryon himself appeared, alerted to the theft by the absence of his dog's barking. The sight of the triple-bodied giant was unlike anything Heracles had faced before. Each of Geryon's 3 bodies was fully armed for battle, wielding shields and weapons with all 6 arms, presenting a formidable opponent even for the mighty son of Zeus. Heracles, recognizing the difficulty of facing 3 adversaries in one, decided to use the element of surprise. Before Geryon could fully assess the situation, Heracles drew his bow and shot a poisoned arrow, still coated with the deadly venom of the Hydra from his second labor. The arrow struck one of Geryon's bodies, and the powerful poison quickly spread, weakening the giant. Though wounded, Geryon fought on with tremendous strength and skill. The battle was long and difficult, with the giant's multiple limbs and coordinated movements making him an exceptionally dangerous foe. Heracles had to employ all his combat experience, dodging attacks from multiple directions while looking for opportunities to strike effectively. Eventually, using a combination of his poisoned arrows, his club, and his supernatural strength, Heracles prevailed. The triple-bodied giant fell, his unique form making his death particularly dramatic and memorable. With Geryon, Orthrus, and Eurytion all defeated, Heracles was free to claim the magnificent red cattle. Gathering the herd, Heracles began the long journey back to Mycenae. This return trip would prove to be as challenging and eventful as the outward journey, if not more so. The difficulties began almost immediately, as Heracles had to navigate the cattle across the wide ocean waters. Some versions of the myth say that Heracles built a raft large enough to transport the entire herd, while others suggest that he drove them along a land route that required him to journey around the entire Mediterranean, creating a ring of adventures and cultural encounters that would become part of his legacy. As Heracles drove the cattle through the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal, he established a series of landmarks and foundations that would be associated with him for millennia to come. The most famous of these were the Pillars of Heracles, 2 great mountains or promontories on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar that marked the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the wider Atlantic Ocean. According to legend, these pillars were either placed there by Heracles as markers of the western extent of his journeys, or they were created when he broke apart a single mountain to create the strait itself, connecting the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. In either case, they became one of the most recognized geographical features in the ancient world, representing the limit of safe navigation and the gateway to the unknown realms beyond. Continuing his journey with the cattle, Heracles encountered numerous adversaries and challenges. In some regions, local kings or warriors attempted to steal the magnificent herd for themselves, forcing Heracles to defend his prize repeatedly. In other areas, natural obstacles like rivers, mountains, or deserts had to be overcome, testing the hero's resourcefulness as well as his strength. One significant encounter occurred in the area of Rome, which had not yet been founded. There, Heracles met a fire-breathing giant named Cacus, who stole some of the cattle while Heracles was sleeping. Cacus dragged the cattle backwards into his cave to make their tracks appear to lead away from rather than toward his lair. But Heracles discovered the deception when the stolen animals bellowed in response to the sounds of the rest of the herd. The hero stormed Cacus's cave and slew the giant, reclaiming his cattle and earning the gratitude of the local population. This incident was later celebrated by the Romans, who incorporated Heracles, whom they called Hercules, into their own mythology and established a cult in his honor at the site of his victory over Cacus. This was one of many examples of how the myth of Heracles' 10th labor became intertwined with local legends and foundation stories throughout the Mediterranean world. As Heracles passed through southern Gaul, modern France, Italy, and across the Balkans, he continued to face challenges and leave his mark on the landscape. He founded cities, established cults, and festivals in his honor, and became part of the cultural heritage of diverse peoples who claimed some connection to his legendary journey. After crossing back into Greece, Heracles had one final significant encounter before reaching Mycenae. Hera, still determined to hinder her husband's illegitimate son, sent a gadfly to scatter the cattle, forcing Heracles to spend considerable time recapturing them. During this delay, a river god named Strymon taunted the hero. In his frustration, Heracles filled the river with rocks, making it unnavigable and demonstrating once again that even divine beings were not beyond the reach of his wrath. When Heracles finally arrived in Mycenae with the cattle of Geryon, King Eurystheus was astonished that the hero had survived yet another seemingly impossible task. The king sacrificed the cattle to Hera, an ironic tribute given the goddess's continued hostility toward Heracles. With the completion of his 10th labor, Heracles might have expected his servitude to Eurystheus to end, as the Oracle of Delphi had originally decreed he must perform 10 labors. However, Eurystheus had previously disqualified 2 of the labors, the slaying of the Hydra, because Heracles had received assistance from Iolaus, and the cleaning of the Augean Stables, because Heracles had arranged to be paid for the work. Therefore, Eurystheus demanded that Heracles complete 2 more labors to fulfill his obligation. Though surely frustrated by this extension of his servitude, Heracles accepted the king's ruling. His journey to Erythea and back had spanned years and continents, leaving an indelible mark on the geography, culture, and mythology of the Mediterranean world. This 10th labor, more than any before it, had transformed Heracles from a Greek hero into a pan-Mediterranean figure whose influence transcended national and cultural boundaries. The acquisition of Geryon's cattle demonstrated yet another aspect of Heracles' heroism. Beyond strength, strategy, endurance, precision, problem-solving, and diplomatic skill, this labor highlighted his cosmopolitan nature and cultural impact. As he traversed the known world and ventured beyond it, Heracles became a connecting figure, a common thread in the mythologies of diverse peoples who might otherwise have little cultural exchange. There is also a symbolic dimension to this labor that resonated with ancient audiences. The journey to the far west, to the very edge of the known world where the sun sets, could be interpreted as a symbolic journey to the realm of death, with Heracles' return driving the red cattle before him, representing a triumphant return from the underworld. This theme of confronting and conquering death would become even more explicit in his final labor. As sleep begins to envelop your consciousness, imagine Heracles standing atop a mountain pass, looking back at the long trail he has traveled, the red cattle of Geryon moving slowly along the winding path below him. 10 labors now complete, just 2 more remained. His next task would take him even further from the familiar world of Greece into the mystical western gardens where golden apples of immortality grew, guarded by nymphs and a never sleeping dragon. As Heracles approached the completion of his ordained labors, the tasks assigned to him by King Eurystheus grew increasingly difficult and remote, taking him to the farthest reaches of the known world and beyond. For his 11th labor, the hero was commanded to retrieve golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, a mystical orchard at the western edge of the world where day and night met. These were no ordinary apples. Their branches were laden with fruit of pure gold that gleamed in the eternal twilight of the garden. The trees had been a wedding gift from Gaia, Mother Earth, to Hera when she married Zeus, and were therefore especially sacred to the queen of the gods. The apples were said to grant immortality to anyone who consumed them, making them one of the most valuable and coveted treasures in existence. Hera, unwilling to leave such precious items unguarded, had entrusted their care to the Hesperides, the nymphs of the evening whose sweet singing could enchant even the most resolute intruder. Their names were Aegle, Erythea, Hesperia, and Arethusa, and they were the daughters of either Atlas or Hesperus, the evening star. As an additional precaution, Hera had placed a fearsome guardian in the garden, Ladon, a 100-headed dragon who never slept. With some heads always awake while others rested, Ladon maintained constant vigilance, his serpentine coils wrapped around the base of the tree, bearing the golden fruit. The first challenge Heracles faced was simply finding the garden. Unlike his previous labors, where the location of his targets was generally known, the Garden of the Hesperides existed in a realm between reality and myth, its exact position a mystery to mortals. Some placed it near Mount Atlas in North Africa, others on distant islands in the Western Ocean, and still others in the northern lands of the Hyperboreans, who lived beyond the north wind. To discover the garden's location, Heracles would need guidance from someone with knowledge of these remote and mystical realms. Thus began a journey that would take the hero across continents and into encounters with various deities and legendary figures, each providing a piece of the puzzle that would eventually lead him to his goal. Heracles first traveled to the Caucasus Mountains, where the Titan Prometheus remained chained as punishment for giving fire to humanity. Though Prometheus had been sentenced by Zeus to have an eagle eat his liver each day, only to have it regrow each night for eternity, his divine foresight remained intact. If anyone knew the location of the Garden of the Hesperides, it would be this ancient being whose gaze penetrated the veils between worlds. When Heracles reached the desolate peak where Prometheus was bound, he was moved by the Titan's suffering. The great benefactor of humanity hung suspended from the rock face, his body ravaged by centuries of torment, yet his spirit unbroken. The eagle was circling overhead, preparing for its daily feast, when Heracles took aim with his bow and shot the bird from the sky with one perfect arrow. Then, using his tremendous strength, Heracles broke the adamantine chains that had held Prometheus for so long. The freed Titan, grateful for his unexpected liberation, shared his vast knowledge with Heracles. He revealed that to find the garden of the Hesperides, Heracles would need to seek out Nereus, the ancient sea god known as the Old Man of the Sea, who possessed the gift of prophecy and could shapeshift to avoid capture. Following Prometheus's advice, Heracles journeyed to the coast, where Nereus was known to rest on the shore during the heat of the day. Upon finding the sea, God sleeping among the rocks, Heracles seized him firmly. Nereus immediately began to transform, becoming in rapid succession a lion, a serpent, a panther, a raging torrent of water, and a searing flame. But Heracles held fast through each metamorphosis, refusing to release his grip. Finally, exhausted and impressed by the hero's determination, Nereus returned to his original form and agreed to answer Heracles' questions. He revealed that the Garden of the Hesperides lay in the far western lands held up by the Titan Atlas, who stood at the edge of the world supporting the heavens on his shoulders, as punishment for his role in the war between the Titans and the Olympian gods. With this knowledge, Heracles set out westward. His journey took him through Libya, where he wrestled and defeated the giant Antaeus, son of Gaia, who gained strength whenever he touched his mother Earth. Heracles overcame this advantage by lifting Antaeus off the ground and crushing him in a mid-air bear hug. Continuing through Egypt, Heracles encountered King Busiris, who had established a custom of sacrificing strangers to end a prolonged famine. When the king attempted to make Heracles his next victim, the hero broke free from his bonds and slew Busiris, ending his reign of terror against travelers. These and other adventures marked Heracles' progress toward the western edge of the world, where Atlas endured his eternal burden. When Heracles finally reached this remote region, he beheld an awe-inspiring sight: the massive Titan Atlas, his body like a mountain, shoulders broad enough to support the vault of heaven, his face etched with the weariness of centuries. Heracles approached respectfully and explained his quest for the golden apples. Atlas listened with interest, for the garden of the Hesperides lay near his station, and the Hesperides themselves were, in some accounts, his daughters. He had intimate knowledge of the garden and its fearsome guardian, Latin. A plan began to form in Heracles' mind. Rather than attempting to battle the 100-headed dragon himself, perhaps there was a more elegant solution. He proposed a deal to Atlas. If the Titan would retrieve the apples for him, Heracles would temporarily take Atlas's burden, holding up the sky while Atlas made the short journey to the garden and back. Atlas, weary after centuries of supporting the heavens, eagerly accepted this offer. Heracles positioned himself beside the Titan, and with careful coordination, the tremendous weight of the celestial sphere was transferred to his shoulders. Atlas stepped away, stretching his arms and back for the first time in ages, reveling in his temporary freedom. The sensation of holding up the sky was unlike anything Heracles had experienced before. The weight was immense, beyond even his godlike strength, pressing him down with each passing moment. His muscles trembled, his bones creaked, and sweat poured from his body with the extraordinary effort, yet he endured, knowing that this trial too would pass. Meanwhile, Atlas made his way to the garden of the Hesperides. Being the father or uncle of the nymphs, he was welcomed rather than challenged. Even Latin posed no threat to the Titan, who easily plucked 3 golden apples from the sacred tree and returned to where Heracles stood, straining under his cosmic burden. Upon his return, Atlas revealed a treacherous thought that had formed during his brief taste of freedom. He told Heracles that he would deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself, leaving the hero to bear the weight of the heavens for eternity. Atlas had no intention of resuming his punishment now that he had experienced release from it. Heracles, despite his physical agony, kept his wits about him. Feigning acceptance of this new arrangement, he made a simple request. Could Atlas hold the sky just for a moment, while Heracles adjusted his lion skin to cushion his shoulders against the burden? Atlas, seeing no danger in this reasonable request, agreed. He carefully took back the weight of the heavens, allowing Heracles to step away. As soon as he was free, Heracles picked up the golden apples that Atlas had set on the ground and prepared to depart, offering his thanks to the Titan for retrieving them. Atlas realized too late that he had been outwitted. Once again, trapped beneath his eternal burden, he could only watch as Heracles began his journey back to Greece with the precious golden fruit. Some versions of the myth suggest that Heracles, in a show of both compassion and power, used one of his arrows to slay the dragon Latin before departing, freeing the garden from its fearsome guardian as a parting gift to the Hesperides. The return journey to Mycenae was long but uneventful compared to the outward quest. When Heracles finally presented the golden apples to King Eurystheus, the monarch was astonished that the hero had succeeded in yet another, seemingly impossible task. After briefly admiring the divine fruit, Eurystheus returned the apples to Heracles, not daring to keep objects so sacred to Hera. Heracles, showing wisdom as well as strength, did not keep the apples for himself. Some accounts say he gave them to Athena, who ensured their return to the garden of the Hesperides, understanding that such powerful objects belonged in their divinely appointed place. This gesture demonstrated Heracles' recognition of and respect for the proper order of the cosmos, an understanding that certain boundaries should not be permanently crossed even by the greatest of heroes. The 11th labor, like those before it, revealed multiple facets of Heracles' heroism. His journey to find the garden demonstrated perseverance and resourcefulness. His liberation of Prometheus showed compassion and a willingness to right ancient wrongs, even those decreed by his own father Zeus. His clever solution to the problem of Latin, using Atlas as an intermediary rather than directly confronting the dragon, showed strategic thinking and diplomacy. In his outwitting of Atlas when the Titan tried to trick him, proved that mental agility could be as important as physical strength, even for the mightiest of heroes. On a symbolic level, the quest for the golden apples carried profound meaning. The apples represented immortality, the divine state that Heracles himself would eventually achieve. That he sought them, but ultimately returned them, suggests an understanding that immortality must be earned through deeds and divine favor, not seized through theft or trickery. The garden itself, located at the western edge of the world where the sun set, carried associations with death and rebirth. Like his journey to Erythea for Geryon's cattle, Heracles' travel to this liminal space between day and night, life and death, represented a symbolic catabasis, or descent to the underworld, foreshadowing his final labor. With 11 labors now complete, Heracles stood on the threshold of fulfilling his penance. Just one task remained, the most dangerous and symbolically significant of all. King Eurystheus, saving his most terrifying command for last, would send Heracles to the very realm of death itself to capture and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the entrance to the underworld. As your consciousness drifts toward sleep, imagine Heracles standing at a crossroads, the golden apples now returned to their rightful place, his path of redemption nearly complete. 11 impossible tasks accomplished, one final challenge awaits. The hero's shoulders, which had temporarily borne the weight of the heavens themselves, now squared with determination as he prepared to confront the ultimate threshold, the boundary between life and death, between the mortal world and the realm of Hades. For his 12th and final labor, Heracles was assigned the most daunting task of all, to journey into the underworld, the realm of the dead ruled by Hades, and bring back Cerberus, the monstrous three-headed hound that guarded its gates. This was not merely a test of strength or courage, but a challenge that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, for no living mortal was meant to enter the domain of the dead, much less return from it. Cerberus was no ordinary beast. Born of Echidna and Typhon, the same monstrous parents who had produced the Nemean Lion, the Lernaean Hydra, and other creatures Heracles had faced, this guardian of the underworld possessed 3 fierce heads with manes of serpents, a dragon's tail, and claws sharp as the finest swords. Some accounts gave him 50 or even 100 heads, though 3 became the standard in most tellings. More terrifying than his appearance was his purpose, to ensure that the dead remained in the underworld and the living stayed out, maintaining the boundary between these realms that was essential to cosmic order. To prepare for this unprecedented journey, Heracles traveled to Eleusis, near Athens, where he sought initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred religious rites that revealed the truths about death, rebirth, and the afterlife. These mysteries were closely guarded secrets, forbidden to be shared with outsiders, but were said to grant initiates special knowledge and protection in their eventual journey to the underworld after death. Before Heracles could be initiated, however, he needed to be purified of the blood he had shed, particularly that of the centaurs during the incident at Pholus's cave prior to his 4th labor. Theseus, the great Athenian hero who had himself been purified for similar reasons, helped sponsor Heracles for these sacred rites. Under the guidance of Eumolpus, founder of the Eleusinian mysteries, Heracles underwent the necessary rituals and became an initiate, gaining spiritual preparation for his descent into Hades' realm. Thus prepared, Heracles sought an entrance to the underworld. There were several such gateways scattered throughout the Greek world, at Cape Taenarum in the southern Peloponnese, at Heraclea Pontica on the Black Sea, at Lake Avernus in Italy, and others. Most accounts place Heracles' descent at Taenarum, where a cave was said to lead deep into the earth, its darkness eventually giving way to the shadowy banks of the river Styx. Guided by Hermes, the messenger god who routinely moved between the realms of gods, mortals, and the dead, Heracles began his descent. The path grew darker with each step, the air cooler and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The sounds of the living world faded, replaced by distant echoes that might have been the whispers of the dead or merely the imagination of a living mind confronting the ultimate unknown. Eventually, Heracles reached the shore of the Styx, the first of 5 rivers that wound through the underworld. There he encountered Charon, the aged ferryman responsible for transporting souls across the dark waters. Normally, Charon would only carry the dead who had been properly buried and could pay his fee with a coin placed in their mouth during funeral rites. A living man, still warm with blood and breath, was a passenger he had not expected. Seeing Heracles approaching, Charon initially refused to transport him. The hero's divine parentage and Hermes's accompanying presence, however, eventually convinced the ferryman to make an exception. Some versions of the myth suggest that Charon was also intimidated by Heracles' obvious strength and the resolute expression that had cowed so many opponents before. Crossing the Styx, Heracles entered the true realm of the dead. The shadowy figures of the departed moved around him, insubstantial as mist, yet recognizable as the people they had once been. Among them, Heracles reportedly saw the spirit of Meleager, a great hero who had participated in the Caledonian boar hunt. The two warriors spoke, and Meleager suggested that Heracles marry his sister Deianira after completing his labors, advice that Heracles would eventually follow, though with tragic consequences not yet foreseen. As Heracles ventured deeper into the underworld, he encountered more challenges. The Gorgon Medusa threatened him, but Heracles, warned by Hermes that she was merely a phantom that could not harm him, stood his ground. When confronted by the specter of Meleager's mother, who had caused her son's death through a mother's curse, Heracles drew his sword, forgetting for a moment that his weapon could not harm the insubstantial dead. Near the entrance to Tartarus, the deepest and most terrible region of the underworld where the wicked were punished, Heracles found the hero Theseus and his friend Pirithous, both trapped on the chair of forgetfulness. The pair had foolishly ventured into the underworld with the intention of abducting Persephone, wife of Hades, for Pirithous. As punishment, they had been bound to stone chairs that caused them to forget who they were and why they had come. Recognizing his friend and fellow hero, Heracles used his tremendous strength to free Theseus from the enchanted chair. When he attempted to do the same for Pirithous, however, the earth shook violently, indicating that Hades would not permit the rescue of the man who had directly plotted against his wife. Reluctantly, Heracles left Pirithous to his fate, understanding that there were limits even to his heroic interventions. Finally, Heracles reached the palace of Hades and Persephone, the black columned hall where the rulers of the dead held court. Unlike the fearful or aggressive reception he had received from many mortal kings during his labors, Heracles found Hades to be dignified and even hospitable in his own severe way. The lord of the underworld listened to Heracles' request to borrow Cerberus for his final labor. Surprisingly, Hades agreed to the request, but with one critical condition. Heracles must subdue the hellhound using only his bare hands, without weapons or divine assistance. This stipulation was partly a test of Heracles' worthiness and partly a practical matter. Hades did not want his valuable guardian damaged by the hero's formidable weapons. Accepting these terms, Heracles sought out Cerberus at his post near the gates of the underworld. The monstrous hound sensed his approach and rose to his full height, all three heads snarling in unison, serpent mane writhing, massive paws scraping the stony ground in anticipation of combat. The beast's eyes glowed with supernatural light, and foam dripped from three sets of fangs, each as long as a man's hand. Drawing on his vast experience in wrestling and grappling, enhanced by the divine strength he had inherited from Zeus, Heracles approached Cerberus with caution but without fear. When the beast lunged, Heracles seized the central head with his powerful arms, using the momentum of the attack to wrestle the enormous creature to the ground. A tremendous struggle ensued, with Cerberus thrashing and snapping with all three heads, clawing at Heracles with his massive paws, and lashing his dragon-like tail. The serpents that formed the creature's mane struck at Heracles like independent attackers, adding to the complexity of the battle. Yet the hero maintained his hold, gradually increasing the pressure around the central neck in a technique similar to the one he had used to defeat the Nemean Lion in his first labor. Cerberus, despite his supernatural nature and fearsome appearance, was not immune to the sensation of being choked. As Heracles maintained his stranglehold, the beast's struggles gradually weakened. The hero did not seek to kill the valuable guardian, but merely to subdue him. When Cerberus finally went limp in surrender, Heracles bound him with the unbreakable chains that had been forged by Hephaestus, which he had brought specifically for this purpose. With Cerberus secured, Heracles returned to Hades' palace to confirm that he had fulfilled the conditions of their agreement. The lord of the underworld, impressed that Heracles had managed to overcome his fearsome guardian without weapons, gave his final permission for the hero to temporarily remove Cerberus from the underworld. Leading the now docile but still intimidating Cerberus, Heracles retraced his steps through the gloomy realm of the dead. Charon ferried them back across the Styx, perhaps even more reluctant to transport the fearsome hound than he had been to carry the living hero. Guided once more by Hermes, Heracles ascended through the cave at Taenarum, bringing Cerberus into the world of the living for the first and only time. The journey to Mycenae with Cerberus was unlike any of Heracles' previous returns with the trophies of his labors. The sight of the three-headed hound caused unprecedented terror wherever they passed. People fled in panic, animals howled in fear, and even nature itself seemed to recoil from the unnatural presence of the underworld's guardian in the realm of the living. When Heracles finally presented Cerberus to King Eurystheus, the monarch's reaction was extreme, even by his standards. At the mere sight of the monstrous hound, Eurystheus leapt into his bronze jar and refused to emerge, begging Heracles to return the creature to the underworld immediately. This was one trophy the king had no desire to claim, even momentarily. Heracles, having technically completed his final labor by bringing Cerberus to Eurystheus as commanded, agreed to return the hound to his proper post. Some versions of the myth say that Cerberus, upon being released from his chains, happily bounded back to the underworld on his own, eager to return to his familiar duties. Others suggest that Heracles personally escorted him back through the entrance at Taenarum, fulfilling his promise to Hades that the arrangement would be temporary. With Cerberus restored to his rightful place and the 12 labors completed, Heracles was finally free of his servitude to Eurystheus. His penance for the tragic deaths of his family, caused by Hera-induced madness, was complete. Though the Queen of Gods never truly reconciled with her husband's illegitimate son, even she could not deny that Heracles had proven himself worthy of the divine heritage that flowed in his veins. The capture of Cerberus represented more than just the completion of Heracles' labors. It symbolized his triumph over death itself. By entering the underworld as a living man and returning unscathed, Heracles demonstrated that the normal boundaries between life and death, mortality and divinity, did not fully apply to him. This foreshadowed his eventual apotheosis, his transformation into a full god after his mortal death, when he would join the Olympians as an immortal. In the years that followed the completion of his labors, Heracles would have many more adventures. He would participate in the voyage of the Argonauts, fight alongside the gods in their war against the giants, marry several times, and father numerous children who would become important figures in their own right. His life would continue to be marked by both triumph and tragedy, glory and suffering. His mortal end would come through the unwitting actions of his final wife, Deianira, who gave him a robe poisoned with the blood of the centaur Nessus, believing it to be a love charm. The poison caused Heracles unbearable agony, and he chose to end his suffering by building his own funeral pyre on Mount Oeta and immolating himself upon it. As the flames consumed his mortal body, his divine essence ascended to Mount Olympus, where Zeus welcomed his son among the immortals. Reconciled at last with Hera, Heracles was given her daughter Hebe as his divine wife, and he assumed his place in the pantheon of Greek gods. The legacy of Heracles extended far beyond his own lifetime, or even the era of Greek civilization. To the Romans, who knew him as Hercules, he became a central figure in their adopted mythology. His cult spread throughout the Mediterranean world, with temples and festivals established in his honor, from Spain to the Black Sea. Later, he would be adopted as a patron and model by various rulers, including Alexander the Great and numerous Roman emperors, who sought to associate themselves with his divine strength and heroic accomplishments. Even in our modern world, Heracles endures as a symbol of courage, perseverance, and the triumph of human potential over seemingly impossible obstacles. His 12 labors continue to resonate as metaphors for the universal human experience of confronting challenges, making atonement for past mistakes, and seeking redemption through decisive action rather than passive regret. As sleep embraces you completely, carrying you toward dreams that are themselves a kind of journey to another realm, remember the example of Heracles, the hero who faced his greatest fears, completed seemingly impossible tasks, and ultimately transformed suffering into transcendence. For in his story, we find not just entertainment, but inspiration, a reminder that within each of us lies the potential for heroism, redemption, and perhaps even a touch of the divine.